Chapter 611. Before 1995, although Microsoft had become the dominant operating system market leader, their annual turnover was only about $2 billion. Their main competitor, Apple's annual turnover was more than $1 billion. Compared to Apple, Microsoft does not have an absolute advantage. There was still more than a year before Windows 95 would be released. Although Microsoft was very optimistic about this new operating system, no one in the world, except for Eric, could have predicted how Windows 95 would destroy everything before it was released. At this time, in a small restaurant near the Harvard Business School library, Bill Gates, who had calmed down, knew that although Yahoo was just a little sheep with little resistance compared to the current Microsoft, there was a behemoth that was even more ferocious than the current Microsoft standing behind this sheep. Bill Gates' original tough attitude was quickly restrained and revealed a shrewd look that was often seen in business negotiations. He said, "Eric, I can consider the suggestion of installing the Internet Explorer browser on Windows that you mentioned just now. It will be Yahoo's browser soon. I think you should know that I had just integrated 3 companies." Bill Gates was unhappy with Eric's sudden interruption, but he still replied patiently. "Fine. Yahoo's browser. If Yahoo's browser is going to be Windows pre-installed software, it must be exclusive to Windows." Although Eric knew the development trend of the operating system market in the next few years, Microsoft's Windows system only had 60% market share. Mac OS, Linux, Unix, and even the original DOS were still in use. He could not reveal any clues in advance. He shook his head and said, "That's impossible. Letting Windows monopolize Yahoo's browser technology in the short term is already the biggest concession I can make. If we follow your suggestion, unless Windows can completely dominate the operating system market, Yahoo will automatically give up more than 40% of the operating system platforms. That's obviously impossible. If Yahoo gives up all other operating systems, it will be binding Yahoo's browser to Microsoft. If Microsoft suddenly turns on them, Yahoo will be in a passive position. Microsoft's reputation in this area is not good. Windows 95 is not released yet, and even Bill Gates does not have the confidence to monopolize the operating system market." Although he did not agree to Eric's suggestion, he did not refute. "I will consider this. But Microsoft will not allow an unrelated company's application to be installed on Windows. If Yahoo's browser is to be installed on Windows, Microsoft needs to get at least 40% of Yahoo's shares. Yahoo will be IPO next year. If you sell 40% of your shares to Microsoft, you all will become Yahoo's biggest shareholder. This is no different from selling Yahoo to Microsoft. Also, Microsoft's offer is much lower than my expectations." Eric had wanted to reject Bill Gates, but he suddenly had an idea. He decided to give Bill Gates a good bait. "I can promise you that Microsoft will acquire 30% of Yahoo's shares. But it will not be now. It will be 5 years later, and I will give you 30% of the shares. 5 years later, Microsoft can choose to acquire 30% of Yahoo's shares based on Yahoo's market value at that time." Bill Gates is thinking in his heart. He has high hopes for Yahoo, but he does not believe that Yahoo can overtake Microsoft in 5 years. Microsoft had estimated Yahoo's value to be between $8 billion to $1 billion. Even with the best estimate, Yahoo's market value will increase by 10 times in 5 years, and Microsoft will only need $3 billion to acquire 30% of Yahoo's shares. Microsoft's market value is increasing by more than 30% every year. 5 years later, Microsoft's market value will increase to $80 to $100 billion. At that time, $3 billion will be nothing to Microsoft. Microsoft only needs to buy 30% of Yahoo's shares in the open market to become Yahoo's biggest shareholder. After that, it will be easy for Microsoft to acquire Yahoo through hostile takeover. Eric had been paying attention to the changes in Bill Gates' expression without batting an eyelid. Seeing Bill's expression gradually relax, or perhaps he had thought of something good, and even revealed a smug smile, Eric knew that Bill Gates had fallen into a trap. Bill Gates felt there are no loopholes in his plan, and he said, "Eric, I can consider this. Also, Yahoo must give Microsoft some of its patents. If you insist, of course, that's not a problem." Eric seemed to be very easy to talk to. He continued to ask, Anything else? That's all for now. If you think of other conditions, we can add them during the negotiation. All right, Eric said. Since you've stated your conditions, I'll talk about mine. If we can reach an agreement, we don't have to consider the details such as exclusive licensing fees. However, Yahoo guarantees that the Yahoo browser on the Windows platform will continue to be ahead of other platforms, but Microsoft must also guarantee that they will not release their own browser software within 5 years. Eric had originally planned to rely on the Windows platform for some of Yahoo's technical software development. Therefore, Yahoo did not even need to make any adjustments to its layout if Windows had the latest technology of Yahoo's browser. At this time, it could be used as a bargaining chip in exchange for some benefits. Bill Gates suddenly felt that Eric was too inexperienced. As long as Yahoo enters the capital market, Yahoo will be Microsoft's in 5 years. Also, 5 years is enough for Microsoft to understand all the technical details of Yahoo's browser and develop a replacement technology. If anything happens, Microsoft can kick Yahoo's browser out of the Windows platform without hesitation. But as a smart businessman, Bill Gates did not agree immediately. Although he does not think it is a big deal, he still wants to pass these terms to Microsoft's strategic development department to study the pros and cons. So Bill Gates continued, "No problem. I can consider it." Eric wasn't as calculative as Bill Gates, and he didn't mind Bill Gates's words being filled with word games like, "can be considered." After all, both parties knew that before the final contract was signed in black and white, any promises at this moment had no legal effect. Also, Eric knew very well that in the new century, browser software would be more of a subsidiary service for internet giants. Compared to the 1990s, the role of the interface had been greatly weakened. What's more, in the original spacetime, even though Microsoft dominated the browser market in the early stages and always occupied a large share of the market, its network business was still beaten by Yahoo, Google, Amazon, and other companies. Basically, it did not generate any profits, and the original best online service, MSN, ended up closing down. After confirming the general intention of cooperation, the sky outside the window was completely dark, and the two parties had no intention of continuing to stay in this small restaurant. Bill Gates wants to visit Yahoo's HQ next year. Eric has to entertain John Chambers and Steve Keys tomorrow, and he does not want to be involved. So he found an excuse to postpone the meeting to 2 days later. After watching the couple leave in the luxury car, Eric took a few steps towards the quiet lawn beside him. He took out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and lit it up. He sat down on the lawn and observed the passers-by in the dark. He was a little curious. He and Bill Gates had already exposed their identities, but they didn't attract any attention. This was beyond his expectations. Carolyn, who was reluctant to leave, sat down beside Eric. She wanted to remind Eric not to smoke on campus, but she saw that Eric seems to be deep in thought, so she did not disturb him. Carolyn looked at Eric's hand and was worried that Eric will throw the cigarette butts around. But then she thought that if he did, she will help him pick them up. When she thought that she can help Eric do something trivial, her mood became a lot better. Eric recalled his negotiation with Bill Gates. Although both parties have reached a preliminary agreement, the specific terms of the contract will be adjusted in the future. The biggest risk in this cooperation is the 30% purchase clause. This is also the biggest bait Eric threw to Bill Gates. If Bill Gates can think of something, Eric can think of it too. However, Fonu had planned for more than 2 years in advance, and he has the advantage of being reborn. If Yahoo's market value is still not enough to stop Microsoft in 5 years, then he will just sell Yahoo and go back to Hollywood. As for other things, Eric didn't care too much. Bill Gates, who relied on software to make his fortune, still cared about the browser software. His classmate could also see that even if Yahoo's browser was completely free, it would still play a huge role in promoting Windows. Therefore, he was eager to come personally to buy Yahoo before Windows 95 was released. What happened in the original universe had proven that Microsoft's browser software does not bring much advantage to their internet business. Eric chose to cooperate with Microsoft because he wants to promote Yahoo's browser when Windows 95 is released next year. He is also worried that Microsoft will use the Windows operating system to introduce a new browser, and set different standards. This will hinder the development of the Internet industry. In the original universe, Microsoft's Internet Explorer and Netscape browser used the same Mosaic core, but they still introduced different standards. This caused a series of website incompatibilities. If Microsoft introduces a new browser with a completely different web page decoding core, the incompatibility will worsen. Eric does not want to have a long technical standard war with Microsoft. Both sides will suffer losses if that happens. Carolyn's gaze followed the cigarette in Eric's hand. However, Eric suddenly turned his head and waved the cigarette in his hand that was about to burn out. He asked, "You want to try it too?" Carolyn quickly shook her head. "No, I don't want to." Eric smiled and got up to extinguish the cigarette. He threw the cigarette into a rubbish bin and asked Carolyn, "Which hostel are you staying in? Shall I send you back?" Carolyn's gaze followed the cigarette into the rubbish bin. She was stunned for a second. When she heard Eric's words, she turned and replied, "I am not staying in a hostel. I am staying in an apartment in the east." Eric followed Carolyn's directions and walked towards the east. He asked, "Why are you staying outside? It is not safe for you to be alone." "No, I am not staying alone. I am staying with my classmates, and it is very close to the school." Eric nodded and did not say anything else. The two walked for a while, and Carolyn found another topic. "Eric, why did you agree to sell 30% of Yahoo's shares to Microsoft? Even if it is 5 years later, it is still very risky." In the original space-time, Yahoo's market value was close to $100 billion. Eric believes that with the series of plans in his memory, Yahoo's market value will increase by several times in this space-time. Even if it is only $200 billion, 30% of Yahoo shares will be $60 billion. It is equivalent to 10% of Microsoft's market value in the original space-time. Microsoft does not have $60 billion in cash. Eric remembered that in the original space-time, Microsoft's sales were only $19 billion at the peak of the dot-com bubble in 1999. It is hard to tell if Bill Gates will be willing to exchange 10% of his shares for 30% of Yahoo's shares. After all, 10% of Microsoft's shares is equivalent to introducing a major shareholder to Microsoft, and this will affect Bill Gates's control over Microsoft. Even if the deal is successful, Eric will not suffer any losses. Windows is a platform that is about to monopolize the market. As long as the PC is not obsolete, Microsoft will continue to bring in huge profits. As Bill Gates continues to reduce his Microsoft shares, Eric might even become Microsoft's biggest shareholder. Moreover, even if Microsoft did not encounter any antitrust investigations in this space-time, the dot-com bubble would inevitably burst one day based on how crazy it was. After the dot-com bubble burst, the share prices of the dot-com companies will plummet. Eric can still use the funds he made during the bubble to complete his second expansion of the dot-com industry. However, this wasn't something he could tell the girl beside him. Eric casually said, "The greater the risk, the greater the reward." Even with all the information that Carolyn had accumulated in her little brain, she could only see the risks involved. She didn't think that Eric would be able to gain anything from this deal. But when she thought about how Eric has created a series of miracles in just a few years, Carolyn did not doubt any of Eric's views. She felt that if she can't think of this, she must be too stupid. As they walked, Carolyn saw the red brick apartment building in the military factory district getting closer and closer. Carolyn felt more and more uneasy. She knew that if she didn't take the initiative to grab hold of something, Eric would send her back, and he would definitely disappear from her life again. Carolyn felt a little flustered when she thought about how she would only be able to see his figure in the newspapers again. After walking a few more steps, the girl finally mustered up the courage to pull Eric and say, "Eric, you said in the restaurant that you wanted to hire me as your personal assistant." Chapter 6:12. If possible, Eric would rather have a delicate girl like Carolyn stay in a castle forever and be a carefree little princess. However, fairy tales could only be fairy tales forever. Moreover, most fairy tales did not have a real ending. Fairy tales that could really happen in this world were even rarer than Disney animated feature films. Faced with Carolyn's beautiful big eyes full of expectations, Eric could not bear to directly refuse, but he still said, "Carolyn, being my assistant is not an easy task. Although you can get an MBA from Harvard, it does not mean that you can adapt to this job. First, you will need to intern in my assistant's office for a long time, maybe a few months, or even a few years. Only by standing out in that environment can you go further." Although Alan did not have much work experience, when he followed Eric, Firefly had just started. Alan's personal qualifications grew almost at the same time as Firefly, so he was competent for this job and stayed by Eric's side for more than 5 years. In the past few years, as the scale of Firefly's system grew larger and larger, in addition to Alan, who was directly responsible for Eric, Eric's personal assistant office gradually expanded to a small team of more than 10 people. Although Eric rarely directly intervened in the management of Firefly, it did not mean that he was indifferent to the company's affairs. The most important part of this small team's work was to be responsible for summarizing the important financial, personnel, project decisions, and other information in Firefly's system, and then hand it over to Eric for review. Another important part of the team's work was to follow up on all the movie and TV series projects that Eric personally decided on in real time, to ensure that these film and television projects did not deviate from Eric's production ideas. Although Chris was basically in charge of Yahoo, AOL, Cisco, Nokia, and other companies, there were still many things that were transferred to Eric through the team. In addition, the team was also responsible for Eric's personal finances, schedule, data collection, and other miscellaneous work. Eric had some thoughts of having a girlfriend. He tried to let Jennifer Connelly, who graduated from Stanford University, train in his assistant's office and then take over Alan's work. However, the girl did not last a month and quit. It was obvious that this job was not easy at all. Therefore, Eric had no confidence in this delicate little girl in front of him, who seemed to break at the slightest touch. However, Carolyn did not have the slightest intention of backing down. She did not want to continue to be an ignorant little girl in an ivory tower. Moreover, as long as she could be closer to him, she was sure that she could overcome any difficulties. Hearing Eric's relaxed tone, Carolyn immediately said happily, "Then I'll take it that you've agreed. After I finish my courses here, I'll go to Los Angeles around September." Eric thought for a moment. He seemed to not remember what he had just agreed to. However, looking at Carolyn's excited expression, he could only ask, "Will your parents agree?" "Eric, I'm already 23 years old. I can decide what I want to do." "Oh," Eric dragged out his words with a smile on his face. He deliberately took a step back and lowered his head to look at Carolyn from head to toe. He had an expression that said, "I didn't know that you were already so old." Faced with Eric's naughty expression, Carolyn revealed a shy and helpless look. Under the streetlights, her originally white little face turned bright red. Eric had originally only wanted to tease her a little. However, when he sensed that Carolyn was gradually showing signs of inferiority, he hurriedly stopped and said, "All right, I promise you. However, I'm not an easy boss. If you don't do your job well, I definitely won't be merciful." Carolyn nodded slightly. Eric looked at his watch. It was not even 8 o'clock yet. If he went back now, he could still talk to Chris and the others about the meeting with Bill Gates. Looking at the brightly lit apartment buildings beside the road, Eric asked, "Let's go. Which building do you live in?" "That one." Carolyn pointed to a red brick apartment in front of them. Walking all the way to the entrance of the apartment, Carolyn reluctantly stopped and asked, "Eric, when are you leaving Boston?" Eric had originally planned to go back the day after tomorrow. However, with the sudden appearance of the students at the door, Eric's itinerary would definitely have to be changed. He said, "I'm not too sure about that. With the sudden addition of the matter just now, I'll probably stay for another 4 or 5 days." Carolyn was originally looking forward to maybe being able to look around Boston with Eric, just like in London and Berlin last year. However, she could also hear from Eric's tone that he would definitely be very busy in the next few days. She could only give up on that idea. After thinking about it, the girl said weakly, "Eric, why don't you come to our apartment for a cup of coffee? I can introduce you to my roommate." Eric hesitated for a moment. Just as he was about to refuse, Carolyn, who had been watching his expression change, said uneasily, "Then if you can't, forget it. Goodbye." Eric sighed in his heart and said, "Okay. However, Carolyn, do you know what it means for a girl to invite a boy to her place for coffee at this time?" Carolyn was stunned for a moment. She recalled some scenes she had seen in books or movies. Her face immediately turned red and she stuttered, Why don't we drink tea?" This girl was starting to act cute again. Eric resisted the urge to smile and said solemnly, "Carolyn, you have to remember that you are absolutely not allowed to invite any man to your place for coffee, tea, juice, milk, or even tap water at this time." Carolyn also reacted at this time. She shyly twirled her two small hands. When she heard Eric say this, she obediently nodded. She brought Eric into the lobby of the apartment building. Carolyn saw the small flag for her mailbox erected on the wall. She walked over and took out a letter. She happily waved it at Eric. She seemed to be sharing her little secret with him. "Eric, my aunt wrote me a letter again." Eric smiled and walked towards the stairs. "Looks like your aunt treats you better than your parents." "Of course not." Carolyn felt around the envelope. She felt that there seemed to be photos inside and impatiently opened it. "It's just that my aunt has left home for many years and has been living in Greece. She wrote me a letter last year and told me not to tell my parents." Eric felt Carolyn's desire to confide in him. He followed the girl's tone and said, "Since she has left for so many years, why did your aunt write you a letter?" "My aunt said that she missed her family." Carolyn carefully took out a few photos from the envelope. Suddenly, she seemed to have thought of something and said, "Oh, that's right. My aunt also mentioned you. She said that she saw something about us in the newspaper." Eric didn't feel that there was anything between him and Carolyn. He guessed that her aunt must have misunderstood. He casually said, "Oh, what did your aunt say?" "She encouraged me to bravely pursue my own happiness and not be restrained by my family." The girl carefully glanced at Eric. Her voice was filled with shyness. Her voice gradually lowered until it was almost inaudible. Eric was somewhat embarrassed and didn't know how to continue the conversation. Carolyn raised the few photos in her hand and handed them to Eric. "Look, this is my aunt." The street lights in the corridor were somewhat dim. Eric took the photos and saw a blonde woman wearing a white dress leaning against the side of a small yacht. Her skin was fair, and she had an elegant temperament. She had a very comfortable smile on her face, and seemed to be in her early 30s. She appeared to be very young, and there were some similarities between her and Carolyn. Eric only stared at the first photo for a few seconds before politely returning it to Carolyn. He complimented her. "Your aunt is very beautiful." "Thank you." Carolyn received the photos and carefully placed them back in the envelope. She said with some regret, "If only I could look like my aunt." Eric thought about the feeling he had just had and said, "I feel that the two of you look quite alike." "My aunt looks more like my grandmother." "We don't look alike." Carolyn shook her head and looked at Eric. She stretched out her small hand and gestured at the top of her head. She said with envy, "Moreover, I mean, if only I could be as tall as my aunt." Eric said, "Your current height is just right. You don't have to be envious of others." Carolyn raised her small face somewhat unconfidently. "Really? It's fake. You're a bad guy." Melanie was in a dilemma as to whether or not she should tell Carolyn about her encounter with Eric Williams. In the end, she still decided to tell her about it. She also felt somewhat guilty for the jealousy she had felt towards Carolyn. Carolyn had always treated everyone around her with sincerity. Melanie felt that she shouldn't have had such thoughts. However, only after eating dinner did Melanie discover that Carolyn still hadn't returned. Thinking about how Howard Hines, who would change girlfriends every other day, had been pestering Carolyn recently, Melanie couldn't help but feel worried. Carolyn was truly too pure and kind. If she was deceived by that fellow, she would definitely be hurt. Just when Melanie decided to personally look for Carolyn, she finally heard the sound of someone opening the door. Melanie hurriedly walked towards the door. Using an excited tone, she said to the pink little figure who had entered first, "Carolyn, guess who I met in the afternoon?" Before Carolyn could reply, another figure followed in. With a smile she said, It can't be me, right? Ah. Melanie opened her mouth in astonishment. Seeing Eric walking in with a smile and looking at her, she hurriedly changed her expression and said, Mr. Williams, so you came here specially to look for Carolyn. I thought it was just a coincidence. Eric had also heard Melanie's voice. Only then did he realize that such a coincidental matter had occurred. He said, It is indeed a coincidence. I didn't know that Carolyn was studying here. Carolyn had originally wanted to introduce the two of them. However, after hearing their words, she was even more astonished. Looking left and right, she asked, You two know each other? I went to the supermarket in the afternoon, and just happened to meet Mr. Williams in the West Street. Melanie gave a simple explanation. She then formally extended her hand towards Eric. Hello, Mr. Williams. I'm Melanie Garrettson. Call me Eric. Eric shook hands with the other party. If it were any other woman, they would definitely question Eric and Melanie's acquaintance at this moment. However, it was clear that Carolyn didn't care about this at all. Instead, she was extremely excited about the coincidence that the two of them were talking about. After letting Eric sit down, Carolyn walked towards the kitchen. Just as she reached the kitchen door, she seemed to have thought of something. Turning her head, she asked, Eric, what do you want to drink? Eric gave a gentle smile and said, Let's just have coffee. Melanie sat down beside Eric. Although she was still somewhat reserved, she was clearly much more talkative than Carolyn. Seeing Eric casually looking around the interior of the apartment, she took the initiative to say, This place was set up by me and Carolyn. Later on, Carolyn can bring you to her room for a tour. It's even more interesting there. As Melanie said this, she gave Eric a flirtatious wink. Eric didn't know what Melanie meant at all. However, a small head immediately popped out from the kitchen. Eric, you're not allowed to enter my room. That's too impolite. When Eric heard Carolyn say this, he more or less understood what was going on. The girl's room was nothing more than something related to him. Don't worry, Carolyn. I won't do that. Carolyn was really relieved. Without hesitation, she retracted her gaze and continued to busy herself. Melanie laughed silently. She reached out and secretly pointed to the door on the left. Eric just smiled and shook his head. Melanie was also just joking. She asked, Eric, did you come to Boston for the matter of the companies on Massachusetts Avenue? That's right. Eric recalled what Carolyn had said in the dining hall about how their teacher had already used these three companies as teaching cases. Glancing at the picture of Carolyn and Melanie smiling brightly on a bridge not far away from the television cabinet, Eric's heart stirred slightly as he asked, Carolyn said in the afternoon that you had used these three companies as case studies to analyze them. What do you think of their situation? Melanie didn't understand why Eric suddenly wanted to test her. However, she also realized that this was definitely not a bad thing. After thinking about it, she said, I don't think you should divide them into three companies. Especially in the future, if you continue to maintain the current state, as the user scale of the three companies increases, there will be more and more management and technical conflicts, which will slow down the development of the three companies. Only by combining them into one can we solve the problem of synergy. In addition, during our investigation, although we didn't get specific data, we also realized that the user scale of these three companies has reached a very terrifying number. Moreover, this expansion speed doesn't show any signs of slowing down. If they can't successfully achieve business transformation, with the rapid increase in operating costs, I think even you will find it difficult to bear this huge expense. Chapter 6:13. After saying this, Melanie suddenly realized that since she could think of these things, Eric definitely would have thought of them. Even if he really didn't, the business elites around him would have thought of these things. Seeing Eric nodding slightly, Melanie asked with a smile, Eric, you came to Boston this time to solve these problems, right? Last week, I just merged the three companies into a brand new Yahoo network company. When Melanie heard Eric say the name of the new company, she showed a look of realization and said, Many people judged in class that the Yahoo portal was the focus of these three companies. Now it seems that this is indeed the case. Eric continued to ask, What do you think about the business transformation? Melanie said, placement advertising and membership services. I can only think of these two for the time being. In addition, I don't agree with the free strategy of the Internet Explorer browser. If a fee-based model is adopted, although the number of users won't expand as fast as it is now, the income brought is enough to maintain the normal operation of the three companies. Eric, can I know why you did this? The Internet Explorer browser has no competitors on all operating systems platforms so far. The free strategy is obviously very irrational. This is an agreement between me and the founder of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee. 2 years ago, many technical standards for the World Wide Web had not been formulated. In order to let the final version of the World Wide Web technical standards tilt toward the Internet Explorer browser, I chose to do this. Moreover, since you have realized that the Yahoo portal is the focus of the three companies, you should also understand that the browser software is more of an interface for Yahoo to expand the user scale of the Yahoo portal. In comparison, the profit of the software is not so important. Melanie remembered that since the World Wide Web was announced to be completely free to all users around the world last year, other small regional networks and fee-based networks quickly disappeared. The World Wide Web had now developed into a global internet network. For the sake of the technical standards of the World Wide Web, Eric chose the free strategy. Although he gave up temporary profits, he gained more. After all, once a standard was set, it would be difficult to change it. Eric, on the other hand, had a browser software product that met these technical standards. In the past 2 years, his company must have built a solid patent wall. Therefore, until someone else broke this patent wall, IE Browser would be the only one with no other browser. Simply put, IE had completely monopolized the Internet interface channel. After thinking about the pros and cons, Melanie somewhat admired the courage of the young man on the other side of the sofa. To be honest, Eric, if I were in your position, even if I could understand the benefits of the browser-free strategy, it would be difficult for me to make the same decision as you. Not everyone can give up tens of millions of dollars of easily obtainable benefits. Although Carolyn was busy making coffee in the kitchen, she had been listening to the conversation between the two. At this time, she walked into the living room with a coffee pot and poured coffee for the three of them. When she heard Melanie's words, she said as if she had been praised, "That's why Eric is so amazing." Melanie looked at Carolyn's proud little face and teased, "Carolyn, why don't you tell me why you got a C in this class?" Carolyn's face was red, but she refuted confidently, "Now I can prove that my judgment is right." Eric, you don't know this, right? Almost all of Carolyn's class grades are A's, but in the case of Yahoo, she only got a C because we didn't investigate the content of the agreement between you and the World Wide Web Alliance. Yet, she insisted that there was nothing wrong with your strategy of making it free. She couldn't provide any evidence, but she still talked back to the teacher. As Melanie spoke, she recalled the situation at that time and laughed. Eric also smiled and said to Carolyn, "Maybe I can prepare some materials for you and let your teacher change your grade." Carolyn sat beside Melanie shyly in the face of the two's teasing. She held onto Melanie's arm and stared at Eric without any lethality. After joking around, Eric picked up the coffee and took a few sips. After putting down the cup, he asked, "Melanie, do you have your own work plan now?" When Melanie heard Eric's words, she immediately understood that Eric was testing her. She shook her head and smiled. "Not yet." "Then, what will it be like to work for me?" Melanie looked at Carolyn's sparkling eyes and asked tentatively, "What about Carolyn?" "Of course it will be the two of you together. In the next few years, I will increase my investment in the internet industry. Currently, my personal assistant team is mostly focused on the media. If you two join, you can make up for the lack of staff in this area." Melanie looked enviously at Carolyn, who was holding on to her arm without any scheming thoughts. Carolyn's eyes were filled with hope that she would agree. Although Eric's invitation was very sincere and she was extremely moved, she could still sense that Eric was doing this because he wanted her to work with Carolyn. At the same time, she would be able to take care of this naive girl without any scheming thoughts. Melanie was born in an ordinary middle-class family. In order to earn enough money for her MBA, she had worked in a securities company in Atlanta for 2 years after graduating from university. During these 2 years, She had deeply experienced the power struggle in the office. In that kind of environment, a girl like Carolyn, who had a pure mind and would not think of the sinister side of people's hearts, found it very difficult to adapt to it. The employees who could be chosen to work for a super media tycoon like Eric were definitely elites. There was no need to doubt their working ability. However, they were definitely more skilled in the office. If Carolyn was thrown into that group of people, even if she had Eric's personal protection, she would only be bullied. Furthermore, that group of people would definitely not let Eric find out that they were bullying this girl. With Carolyn's personality, she might not even find out herself. Eric did not realize that Melanie had already guessed his thoughts. Seeing the hesitation on the girl's face, he said, "Although you will only be my personal assistant, this job will definitely have great prospects for promotion." My original first assistant, Alan Fissman, had already become the deputy general manager of the primetime program production department at ABC Television Network last month. In the past few years, many people in the office have also been promoted to management. Moreover, after a few years of training, you will find that even if you can't get promoted within Firefly, there will still be many headhunting companies that will be happy to poach you. The last point was something that Alan occasionally told Eric as an interesting matter. In order to find out the secret of Firefly's continuous success, the assistants in Eric's assistant office who were responsible for following up on the progress of the films were always poached by other film companies with high salaries. In the past few years, the assistants in charge of these jobs had been changed several times. It was only until Firefly's Human Resources Department formulated a very strict confidentiality clause, an employment contract, that this trend gradually cooled down. Moreover, many film companies slowly understood that the biggest secret of Firefly's success was Eric's brain, and not the eyes in the assistant office. However, even so, the practice of poaching people from Eric's assistant office had never stopped, especially every time Firefly's films became a big success. Melanie was, of course, clear about the promotion prospects of this job. Being the assistant of a legendary tycoon like Eric who had created a series of business miracles, even if it was just a question, this job's resume was already more valuable than her MBA degree from Harvard. However, after hesitating for a while, Melanie finally couldn't help but agree when she felt Carolyn gently shaking her arm. If she was a maid, then so be it. In any case, not only did this princess not put on any airs, she didn't even know her own identity. After Eric left, Melanie pinched Carolyn's delicate face in the same way as Eric did, and said with a tone of envy, "He's really good to you. No wonder a silly girl like you is so dead set on sticking to him." Early in the morning, Eric slightly tidied himself up because John Chambers and Steve Keys were coming over one after another. After washing up, he shaved off the messy stubble that had accumulated for many days. Standing in front of the mirror in the room, he stared at his young face for a few seconds, and an inexplicable feeling emerged from the depths of his heart. Could it be that he had become more handsome? Just as he was joking with himself in front of the mirror, Eric heard the doorbell ring. He quickly wiped his face with a towel, put on a light gray checkered shirt, and opened the door. After saying good morning to Chris, who was outside the door, the two chatted casually and walked to the restaurant together. There weren't many guests at the hotel for breakfast. A few days ago, he met Tina Brown, but after this woman who was always in a rush to do things was confirmed to be working at Yahoo, she couldn't wait to immerse herself in her work. Now, she had rented a house not far from Yahoo's headquarters, and she was even planning to move her husband and children to Boston. Last night, Eric and Chris had discussed in detail the intention of cooperation after meeting with Bill Gates. They also informed the other people in charge of Yahoo through the phone. After breakfast, Eric and Chris hurried to Yahoo's headquarters. It was just past 8 o'clock, and Ian Neer and a few other people in charge had already arrived at the company. As the former manager of Oracle Software, which regarded Microsoft as its archenemy, Ian Neer knew more about Bill Gates' style of doing things than anyone else in the room, so he was very worried. Ian Neer knew very well that if he didn't choose to cooperate with Microsoft, then Yahoo and Microsoft would definitely go against each other. And the current Yahoo was not qualified to go against Microsoft at all. Although Ian Neer had Eric as his backer, and Eric had said that he would do his best to support Yahoo, Ian Neer still felt that according to the market rule of capitalists pursuing profits, if both parties were going against each other, Eric would most likely give up Yahoo to get more profits. In Ian Neer's view, Eric's career was based in Hollywood, and giving up Yahoo would not cause much harm to him. Now, although Eric had chosen to cooperate with Microsoft, this cooperation agreement was very disadvantageous for Yahoo. Yahoo will be going IPO next year, and in 5 years, to get enough development funds from the financial market, Yahoo must sell at least 20% of its shares, and the management will get 20% of the shares. That means Eric, the major shareholder, will not own more than 60% of the shares. Once Microsoft gets 30% of the 5-year shares, Eric's shares will drop to less than 30%. To Ian Neer, this was no different from handing over the control of Yahoo to someone else 5 years later. As a middle-aged man in his 40s, Ian Neer had seen Yahoo's browser software, portal, online mail, and other services create a series of miraculous growth figures. He knew that he might be involved in the start of a new era. So among the people in the room, he was the one who did not want his efforts to go down the drain. Ian Neer expressed his thoughts to everyone in the room. He does not object to cooperating with Microsoft, but he hopes Eric will be more careful when choosing the cooperation method. Eric patiently listened to Ian Guarnier finish his sentence and said sincerely, "Ian, do you know why I'm willing to offer 30% of the shares?" Not only Ian Neer but Steve Mitnick and the rest were also puzzled. Only Chris, who had gotten the answer in advance, was slightly calmer. Eric attracted everyone's attention and said confidently, "Because I had never intended to sell any of my Microsoft shares." The people around him were even more puzzled after hearing Eric's words. Eric paused for a while and continued, "Yahoo was built from scratch by everyone, and I know all of you treat Yahoo like your own child. I feel the same way, and my expectations for Yahoo are much higher than all of you. The reason why I agreed to sell 30% of Microsoft's shares in 5 years is because I hope Microsoft will realize they cannot afford it after 5 years. It is not difficult to achieve this. With Yahoo's explosive growth, even if Yahoo's market value is only 1/3 of Microsoft's, Bill Gates will realize that if he uses 10% of Microsoft's shares to exchange for 30% of Yahoo's shares, he will have a major shareholder who will affect his control over Microsoft. If he still wants to annex Yahoo, he might even find himself bringing in a group of major shareholders who will threaten his position. Do you all think Bill Gates will insist on buying the shares or give up?" Chapter 6:14. After Eric finished speaking, the conference room fell into silence. Although Eric's description of the future was very encouraging, Ian Neer and the others still couldn't help but think that it would be great if this plan succeeded, but what if it failed? After a while, Chris suddenly thought of something and said in a light tone, "Firefly Group was just a small production company 6 years ago." The silence was broken. Steve Mitnick, who had been looking at the laptop in front of him, looked up and said, "I agree with Eric's plan. If we don't even have the confidence to catch up with 1/3 of Microsoft's market value in 5 years, why don't we all leave now? I'll go back to Dallas tomorrow and continue to help my old man promote junk bonds." His words were not funny at all, but the people in the conference room chuckled. Then Jeff Locke, who was the most reserved and steady of the three, also raised his hand and said, "I agree too." The remaining Ian Neer and Tina Brown looked at each other and nodded one after another. "Then let's talk about the specifics. I originally wanted to launch the IES scripting language and YCR chat software as soon as possible, but the launch of these 2 projects will once again change the industry's evaluation of Yahoo's value, and it may also make Microsoft more desperate. So before the negotiation with Microsoft ends, all the promotion plans for these 2 projects will be temporarily put on hold. Also, what other ideas do you all have? Feel free to speak your mind." Ian Neer said, "Compared to the benefits of the Windows platform and Yahoo's browser technology priority agreement for the promotion of Microsoft's operating system, restricting Microsoft from launching browser software for 5 years is definitely not enough. I think we shouldn't authorize Microsoft's browser patent. Microsoft will definitely not agree to not authorize anything at all." Eric thought for a while and said, "When you negotiate, try to make the terms related to the patent authorization as difficult as possible, so that Microsoft will focus more on this aspect. However, as long as we consolidate the position of Yahoo's website, online mail, and other products on the internet, the browser interface will no longer be so important. So we don't have to strictly guard the browser patent like Microsoft. Ask for another low-interest loan. Steve Mitnick had a sly look in his eyes. He looked at Eric and said, "I know you don't lack money, but the more we ask, the more Microsoft will look down on Yahoo. Letting the enemy look down on us should bring us a lot of benefits." Everyone discussed the cooperation agreement between Eric and Bill Gates last night, and confirmed the bottom line of Yahoo's cooperation. It was almost noon, and Eric set off to the airport to meet John Chambers and Steve Case, who had just arrived in Boston at the same time. Although the internet industry in the United States had always been at the forefront of the world, because AT&T, Comcast, Time Warner, and other internet service providers that monopolized the market had never been active in improving the internet speed in pursuit of higher profits. As a result, the average internet speed of American internet users was basically ranked outside the top 10 in the world. Therefore, the internet speed in the United States had even become an obstacle to the development of the internet industry. In the original spacetime, internet giants such as Google and Facebook were aware of this problem, so they launched high-speed broadband services, which caused the catfish effect, forcing those industry monopolies to choose to speed up. In 1994, the internet industry had just emerged, and the key problem that restricted the development of the internet was still the internet speed. At this time, internet service was charged by the hour. Not only was it expensive, but the average user's internet speed was below 256 kilobits per second. Because the fixed phone's bandwidth without a modem was only 256 kilobits per second, and in the case of a poor network, it took a few minutes to download a 1 megabyte file. The slow internet speed at this time was still not due to technical limitations. ADSL broadband technology had appeared, but the internet service providers that monopolized the market had no intention of upgrading. Because of the internet speed limit, the Yahoo portal had to artificially reduce the content to ensure a good user experience. Although the Clinton administration strongly supported the development of the information industry, if there were no practical benefits, the giants that monopolized the market would not pay attention to any policy documents issued by the White House. The explosion of the internet industry at the end of the century was ultimately driven by profit. Eric's main purpose in inviting John Chambers and Steve Keyes to Boston was to join forces with Cisco and AOL to push the internet industry into the fast lane, ahead of time. Eric's current identity and wealth also ensured that he had enough power to push this matter. After picking up John Chambers and Steve Keyes from the airport, Eric took them to visit the Yahoo headquarters after a simple lunch. In addition to some confidential projects and information, Ian Neer personally showed John Chambers and Steve Keyes most of the technological achievements of Yahoo Network in the past 2 years in browser software, online email services, and other products. When they walked out of the Yahoo headquarters, it was already dusk. Steve Keyes looked back at the still brightly lit Yahoo headquarters office building with mixed feelings. When IE and Yahoo emerged, Steve Keyes hoped that Eric could sell these companies to AOL. After being rejected, Steve Keyes was not discouraged. Instead, he wanted to compete. Last year, AOL had launched its own portal, AOL, but the number of users was far less than Yahoo. At first, Steve Keyes thought that this was mainly because of the advantage of IE. However, after visiting a series of technological achievements that were far ahead of AOL, Steve Keyes realized that it was impossible for AOL to surpass Yahoo in the internet business. In contrast, John Chambers was much more relaxed. When he was confirmed as the CEO of Cisco, Eric, a major shareholder, publicly expressed his support for him at the shareholders' meeting. This played a great role in his position as CEO and the smooth implementation of his development strategy. Although they didn't meet much, John Chambers was still very fond of Eric. Although Eric didn't explicitly state the intention of this invitation on the phone, John Chambers still rushed over from San Francisco despite his busy schedule. After dinner, Chris, John Chambers, Steve Keyes, and Ian Neer gathered again in Eric's suite at the Cambridge Hotel. You can take a look at these documents first, we'll talk later. Eric distributed several prepared documents to them. Although Chris had already read them in advance, he began to read them again. Eric walked to the small bar in the guest room and made coffee for them. He said casually, "In the 1980s, the alliance of Microsoft, IBM, and Intel could be said to be a golden triangle. Microsoft was responsible for the development of the operating system software platform. IBM provided the best PC equipment, and Intel was dedicated to the processor chip technology. It can be said that the rapid popularization of the PC is closely related to the close cooperation of the three companies. Now they have also gained a leading commercial position in the relevant fields. I think the next few years will be an important opportunity for the development of a new internet industry. So why don't we set up an alliance similar to Microsoft, IBM, and Intel?" After many years of development, Cisco had established its position as the leader in the field of network solutions, equipment, and related software. As the helmsman of Cisco, John Chambers also felt the budding and rapid development of the internet industry in recent years. During this time, he occasionally thought about how to take the opportunity to further Cisco's development. At this time, the Information Industry Alliance plan in his hand made his recent thoughts suddenly clear. Cisco, AOL, and Yahoo represented network equipment providers, network service providers, and network content providers respectively. The business areas of the three companies covered the entire network hardware and software industry. It was conceivable that if they could work closely together, the alliance formed by the three companies would definitely become an unparalleled behemoth in this new high-tech industry. After carefully reading the 7 to 8 pages of the Information Industry Alliance plan twice, John Chambers opened another document. This one was about the application prospects of ADSL broadband technology. John Chambers was no stranger to ADSL technology, but there was still disagreement within Cisco on whether to focus on this technology and develop corresponding products. At the same time, John Chambers was also very confused. Why would Eric pay attention to such a highly specialized technology with a limited application range? He looked up curiously and saw Eric personally handing him a cup of coffee. After thanking him, John Chambers did not rashly ask his doubts. He opened the document in his hand and continued to read. Eric, of course, could feel John Chambers' doubts, but he did not intend to explain. Anyway, he had shown enough abnormalities, so it did not matter if there were more. After more than 10 minutes of silence in the living room, John Chambers and the others closed the documents in their hands. Except for Steve Keys, everyone looked a little excited. Eric first looked at Steve Keys and said, "Steve, what do you think of this alliance plan?" Steve Keys smiled bitterly. At this time, AOL already had millions of fixed users. Although it could not be compared with traditional network service providers such as AT&T, it was already the most popular among the emerging companies in the industry. Before seeing the Information Industry Alliance plan in his hand, Steve Keys had realized something, but he was still a little unwilling. But now, he found that if AOL did not join the alliance plan, Eric would definitely choose another partner. At that time, although Eric held 30% of AOL's shares, compared to Eric's complete industrial layout plan, hundreds of millions of dollars of shares were not worth mentioning. Eric would definitely choose to suppress AOL without hesitation. After hesitating for a moment, Steve Keys asked, "Eric, besides AOL, have you considered other partners?" Eric didn't mind the other meanings behind Steve Keys's question. He smiled and said, "AT&T, Comcast, and the other traditional internet service providers claim to have monopolized the market. They no longer have much initiative. It's almost impossible to get them to take the initiative to carry out large-scale technology upgrades. Therefore, they aren't in the consideration of Yahoo's partners. Among the second-tier network service providers, only AOL meets Yahoo's requirements." Steve Keys looked slightly relaxed, but when he saw Eric's relaxed look, he suddenly remembered that the reason why AOL could develop rapidly in the past 2 years was because of the $60 million investment provided by Firefly 2 years ago. Then he looked at Cisco's CEO, John Chambers, and the timing of Yahoo's emergence. Although Steve Keys was unwilling to admit it, he realized that Eric had probably been planning for today's plan since 2 years ago. Since this legendary young man had begun planning for today's situation 2 years ago, It was impossible that he did not consider today's situation. The main difference between Eric and Steve Keyes was the online business such as AOL's portal. The alliance plan clearly stated that once AOL joined the information industry alliance plan drawn up by Eric, it would need to withdraw from the portal and other online businesses, and focus on the role of network service provider. However, seeing the development of Yahoo's portal, Steve Keyes was somewhat reluctant to give up the online business. Eric certainly considered today's situation. However, AOL only had about 20% of the Internet users in the United States at this time. Compared to Yahoo's large-scale promotion of Internet Explorer, AOL's portal could only rely on its own client software to influence the number of users that it could influence. However, Yahoo's total number of users worldwide had exceeded 20 million. Therefore, Eric believed that the possibility of Steve Keyes refusing was very low. However, even if Steve Keyes chose to refuse, Eric was not without a backup plan. The YCR instant messaging software would be launched soon. Eric could imitate Microsoft's strategy in the original Spacetime, and let Yahoo personally enter the field of network service providers. Like MSN, they could integrate the dial-up internet module into the YCR chat tool, and use YCR's market advantage in the future to quickly promote Yahoo's network access business. However, the scope of Yahoo's business would expand again, and Ian Neer and the others would not be able to concentrate on implementing the Yahoo Technology Alliance and Yahoo Advertising Alliance plans. This was not the result Eric wanted to see. Chapter 6:15. AOL was a company established by Steve Keyes and several partners. Steve Keyes did not have absolute control over AOL. 2 years ago, after Firefly invested in AOL, it became the largest shareholder of AOL with 30% of its shares. This was also the reason why Steve Keyes insisted that Eric not participate in AOL's management for a period of time. At this time, there was less than a year left before Firefly's 3-year agreement to not participate in AOL's management, but Steve Keyes felt that Eric did not care much about AOL's management rights. This young man's vision had always been on a broader industrial chain. After weighing the pros and cons for a moment, Steve Keyes probed, "Eric, I personally very much hope to join this alliance plan, but I don't think AOL needs to separate all of its online business, right?" In the original Spacetime, AOL was stimulated by the extremely frothy online business in the later stages of the dot-com boom. It completely deviated from its own development foundation and focused more on web portals and other online businesses. After the dot-com bubble burst, it suddenly realized that its technical expansion in the broadband field was even worse than traditional internet service providers. This also led to the rapid loss of AOL's online users. After the prosperity dissipated, the behemoth with a market value of more than $170 billion was packaged and sold by Time Warner, leaving only an empty shell of more than $4 billion. When he first chose to invest in AOL, Eric originally had the idea of letting AOL continue to harm Time Warner. However, after thinking about some things in depth, Eric gradually dispelled this slightly evil idea. Instead of watching an expensive fireworks show worth hundreds of billions of dollars during the dot-com bubble burst, it was better to adjust AOL's trajectory and let this company become a part of his own wealth empire. Steve, although it's a few years later than AOL, with Yahoo's current huge user advantage, it's not difficult for Yahoo to enter the field of internet service providers and surpass AOL. However, I won't choose to do this unless it's absolutely necessary, because I want Yahoo to focus on its own business and do it to the best of its ability. Similarly, I also hope that AOL can fulfill its role as an internet service provider. I believe that with the close cooperation of our three parties, AOL will only need a few years to surpass traditional service providers like AT&T and Comcast. At that time, AOL can also expand into the field of cable TV service providers through mergers and acquisitions. At that time, Firefly Group can also provide cable TV content support for AOL. Having said that, Eric paused for a moment, giving Steve Keyes a moment to think before saying in a solemn tone, "So now between becoming an industrial giant or persisting in diversified development and not being able to achieve anything, which do you choose?" Steve Keyes showed a faint bitter smile. He could hear that Eric didn't give him a second choice. If they couldn't become allies, it was likely that they would become enemies. He was also moved by Eric's words. If he could become an industry giant like AT&T, Comcast, and Time Warner, it wouldn't be so difficult to give up the online business. Eric, after all, this matter involves the future of AOL. I need to communicate with Bill and the others. In addition, Steve Case waved the alliance plan in his hand and said, although AOL has already made profits, the existing capital is completely insufficient to support this plan. I hope that AOL can start the IPO plan ahead of time. Under normal circumstances, in a mature capital market, after a company went public, as more investors joined, the shares would become more and more dispersed. The shareholders' right to speak would gradually weaken, and the corresponding management would also gain more power. Although he was already inclined to Eric's plan, Steve Case still didn't want AOL to completely become a chess piece in Eric's industrial layout. He hoped to gain more control. In order to get more funds after the IPO, I hope AOL can continue to go public at the same pace. Eric shook his head and rejected Steve Case's suggestion. He didn't mind Steve Case's desire to gain more control. However, at this time, AOL's market value was less than $2 billion. Even if they publicly issued 10% of the shares, the amount of financing would not exceed $200 million. However, if they could push back the time by a year, with the same proportion of shares, the funds raised would definitely be doubled. After directly extinguishing Steve Case's idea, Eric quickly gave him a sweet date. As long as AOL agrees to this alliance plan, Firefly can provide $200 million of low-interest debt financing for AOL, without any additional conditions. As an ally, Yahoo will also use portals and other platforms to take the initiative to promote AOL. They can even become AOL's network service distributor. Hearing the promise of $200 million of low-interest debt financing, Steve Case didn't have much resistance in his heart. However, Steve Case asked in confusion, Eric, what does it mean for Yahoo to become AOL's distributor? Eric said, Yahoo is about to release an application software. I believe that the popularity of this software is absolutely no less than the online mail service and browser software. If AOL is willing, Yahoo can build an AOL network login module into this software. I believe that this will greatly promote the promotion of AOL's network access business. Moreover, because the business core is not in this area, Yahoo only needs to ask for a share slightly higher than the maintenance cost. At present, most operating systems did not have a dedicated network connection function. In order to access the Internet, in addition to the necessary hardware, it also needed to be loaded with the network service provider's login software. This login method could provide a platform for advertising and promotion for the service provider to earn a lot of extra profits. Therefore, it had not completely disappeared until more than 2 decades later. If the application software that Eric mentioned could really be as popular as the browser software, Steve Case certainly wouldn't refuse this cooperation. When he continued to ask, Eric did not reveal more. At this point, the issue of AOL's alliance was basically resolved. The specific cooperation plan would only be discussed after Steve Case gave a definite answer tomorrow. Eric then couldn't wait to talk with everyone about another plan to promote the construction of the ADSL broadband network. This was the most urgent matter at the moment. Eric's requirements were not high. With the current limitations of the Internet, which could only provide text, pictures, and a small amount of audio content, as long as the average speed was raised to a stable 512 kbps as soon as possible, and the charging model was changed to provide a cheap monthly package, then Yahoo's development in the next few years would not be limited by the Internet environment. After many years of operation, AOL had accumulated enough experience in network construction and service operation. Cisco's leading technology could also quickly solve the hardware needed for the construction of the new broadband network. They could even provide a complete network solution for AOL. Firefly and Yahoo's advertising resources in film and television media and online portals would also solve the promotion problem of the new network service. Therefore, the slightly excited people chatted, and unknowingly, the whole night had passed. Even if the 5 people present were not workaholics, It was common for them to work overnight. When the sky outside the window gradually brightened, the 5 people did not feel sleepy at all. They just went back to their individual rooms to wash up, and then went downstairs to have breakfast together. Throughout the night, perhaps because the more they talked, the more engrossed Eric was in the conversation. He unconsciously revealed a lot of internet concepts that had not yet appeared. Big data, cloud computing, e-commerce, antivirus software. In short, he said whatever came to mind. When he noticed that the expressions of the other 4 people had changed significantly, he quickly stopped talking. Even so, Eric knew that his image in their minds was probably close to that of an alien. Steve Case even had the idea of opening a chain of AOL internet cafes in major cities in the United States because of Eric's hint. It turned out that there was no concept of internet cafes in 1994. Eric did not have a good impression of internet cafes in his memory, but he knew that because of the strict supervision system, internet cafes in the West were not rampant. However, as a certain theory said, everyone could cook at home, but restaurants were still everywhere. The same was true for internet cafes. In his memory, internet cafes in the West should be called internet cafes. Most of them were a combination of internet cafes and coffee shops, more similar to a leisure place. Eric was also very supportive of Steve Case's idea. The emergence of internet cafes in advance was like the free Wi-Fi provided by technology giants like Google more than a decade later. It could allow more ordinary people to access the internet. If AOL's chain of internet cafes was really big enough, it would also play a role in promoting the popularization of the internet. However, these needed to be upgraded after AOL's ADSL broadband technology was implemented. Moreover, when Windows 95, a simpler and easy-to-use operating system, was released, coupled with ADSL high-speed broadband, the feasibility of this plan was indeed very high. Last night, Steve Case originally planned to delay it with the excuse of discussing it with other partners. However, this morning, Steve Case became a fanatical supporter of Eric's Information Industry Alliance plan after being influenced or brainwashed by Eric's description of the broad prospects of the internet industry. It was just a simple phone call with other partners and some executives of AOL, and the matter was settled. Of course, there was no obstruction on John Chambers' side. Compared to AOL, Cisco's current equity was more dispersed. Except for the largest 21% stake in Eric's hands, there were no other shareholders with more than 10%. Therefore, as the CEO, John Chambers could completely decide this matter. In this case, taking advantage of the opportunity that Eric was still in Boston, several people directly began to discuss the next stage of the cooperation plan. On the other hand, Bill Gates, who came to Boston again after many years, was also quite glamorous. Speeches, interviews, and banquets from several universities and local media celebrities in Boston followed one after another. The original agreement with Eric to visit the headquarters of Yahoo was obviously forgotten by him. Eric was busy discussing the cooperation of the Information Industry Alliance with John Chambers and Steve Case. He hoped that Damon could be glamorous for a few more days. When Bill Gates finally heard the news of Eric's meeting with John Chambers and Steve Case, he personally called. The alliance plan between Yahoo, AOL, and Cisco had basically been drafted. Eric was too familiar with Bill Gates' style of doing things, so he never thought of pulling Damon in. This was a master who wanted to get involved in any business. Although they cooperated with IBM in the 1980s, because Microsoft wanted to get involved in the hardware business that overlapped with IBM in recent years, there were deep cracks between the two sides. If it were not for the difficulty of the development of the processor chip, Eric believed that Microsoft would absolutely not mind getting involved in Intel's territory. In the original space-time, when it came to all areas of the internet industry, Microsoft basically held the attitude of seeing a wild goose flying by, regardless of whether it ate it or not. They did not let go of any portal, instant messaging, online mailbox, etc. As for the upcoming cooperation with Microsoft, Eric did not hide it from John Chambers and Steve Case. He also revealed a little about the reason and purpose of doing so. This did not hinder the alliance agreement between the three parties at all. After some amendments to the cooperation plan, Ian Neer, John Chambers, and Steve Case signed the agreement on behalf of Yahoo, Cisco, and AOL respectively. Then John Chambers and Steve Case rushed back to their respective companies and began the early stages of the implementation of the Alliance Plan. At this stage, there was no need to hide the instant messaging software and browser scripting language projects from Steve Case and John Chambers. In order to facilitate communication between several people scattered across the United States, Eric deliberately used the YCR instant messaging software, which was still in the closed beta state, to establish the first official chat tribe in the history of instant messaging. He pulled in all the main people in charge of these companies and gave the YCR tribe a very cool name, Firefly Empire. Many years later, a legend had been circulating in the YCR circle, the world's most widely used instant messaging software. In the huge YCR social network world, there was a very mysterious tribe. This tribe did not even have a serial number. Ordinary people absolutely could not find it, let alone have the qualifications to join at will. Even if a user wanted to establish a fake tribe with the same name, the system would explicitly prohibit it. Any member of this tribe had a position in their respective industry. Any news from this tribe could cause economic fluctuations on a global scale. Many people who were lucky enough to have access to bits and pieces of information about this tribe said that the ones who really had the ability to control the world were not the ridiculous Rothschild, not the Jews, and not the so-called Freemasonry, but a group of people in the electronic tribe called Firefly Empire, who really controlled the global economic lifeline. Chapter 616. At the end of May, the $8 billion bonds issued by Firefly Group for the acquisition of ABC gradually entered the actual distribution stage. Therefore, as the first summer after completing the acquisition of ABC Television Network, this summer was crucial for Firefly. Once the summer movies could not continue the excellent box office performance of Firefly's films in previous years, it would seriously dampen the investment institution's interest in investing in Firefly Group bonds. Although Firefly's acquisition of ABC had been settled, in recent months, investors and the media's attention on Firefly Group had not decreased at all. Under the attention of a large number of people, the 3 films released by Firefly during the summer vacation this year also aroused a lot of doubts. Whether it was the war film Saving Private Ryan, or the 2D animation The Lion King, they were not favored by the media and investment institutions. At the same time, because Arnold Schwarzenegger had just failed in Last Action Hero last year, this year's True Lies with Cameron had not even been released yet, but it had already caused some boos. Moreover, the critics blamed Eric's personal blindness and arrogance for Firefly's abandonment of its own advantages in CG special effects films and the creation of unpopular films. They claimed that Eric had been completely blinded by his past success and regarded himself as an omnipotent god. At the same time, many shareholders, including Buffett, asked Eric about the purpose of handing over the popular special effects film projects such as Men in Black, Night at the Museum, and Resident Evil. Although these shareholders all used a harmless negotiating tone, Eric could still feel a strong distrust. He also understood that these shareholders asked him not to support the competitors. The trip to Boston, which was originally planned for a week, was postponed from May 9th to May 25th. Although many things were still unfinished, Firefly Group was an important source of funds for Eric's subsequent series of industrial layout. Therefore, feeling that the secret forces inside and outside Hollywood were becoming more and more restless, Eric handed over the cooperation negotiations with Microsoft to Chris and the Yahoo management team, and hurried back to Los Angeles to preside over the situation. As soon as Firefly's commercial plane landed at the Santa Monica Airport in Los Angeles, Eric rushed to Firefly's headquarters in Burbank. Beverly Hills Cop 3, which is released today, and The Mummy, which is released 2 days later, will be important competitors to Saving Private Ryan a week later. Paramount has arranged more than 2,900 screens for Beverly Hills Cop 3. Universal Pictures' hairstyle strategy for The Mummy is obviously imitating last year's Jurassic Park. The Mummy's opening canvases even reached 3,100 screens. Paramount's other film, Star Trek VII, was scheduled to be released on June 17th, right after True Lies on June 10th. The production cost of this film was only $35 million. The the quality was definitely not comparable to True Lies. However, Paramount did not have any pressure on the box office and was very relaxed in terms of publicity. Moreover, the Star Trek series had accumulated popularity for decades. Once this film became a blockbuster, it would have a great impact on the box office of True Lies. Finally, Warner Pictures Law Enforcement suddenly changed its schedule at the beginning of the month and chose to release at the same time as The Lion King, on June 24th. Their intention to target is even more obvious. In the conference room at Firefly's headquarters, Michael Lynn explained the recent situation with a worried look. After listening to Michael Lynn, Eric asked, "What about July?" Michael Lynn knew that Eric was asking about the two films in July, Breakin' Pretty Baby and Men in Black. These two films were released by MGM and Columbia respectively, but Firefly still had a large share of the rights. Breakin' Pretty Baby, Men in Black and Fox's Dumb and Melon 2. There are no comparable competitors in the same period. In the original spacetime, the reason why Dumb and Melon 2 appeared more than 10 years later was mainly because the producers could not afford to hire Jim Carrey after the first Dumb and Melon. Now that the copyright of Dumb and Melon had fallen into the hands of the rich Fox, this problem was of course no longer a problem. It was not surprising that a sequel would be released. After listening to Michael Lynn, Eric chuckled and said, "They are quite relaxed." Michael Lynn said, "I have been asking the public relations department to keep an eye on the recent trend of you, Lewin, and I have sent lawyers' letters to 6 newspapers and television stations that maliciously attacked. The publicity department has drafted a plan for an additional $10 million for each film. I had someone send it to your email last night. Maybe you haven't had time to see it yet." Eric nodded first to express his affirmation of Michael Lynn's work, but then he shook his head and said, "There is no need to increase the publicity fee. The average publicity fee for each of the 3 films is $40 million. The advertising effect has already reached saturation. It is not worth it to continue to increase the publicity fee. It is not the first time we have encountered this kind of situation. There is no need for us to be in a hurry to deal with it. In fact, you should also be able to see that they are betting that Firefly will encounter a failure this summer. Whether it's the unpopular Saving Private Ryan, the genre failure True Lies, or the completely changed The Lion King, they've all given them a hint that Firefly is likely to encounter failure. They're just waiting for this moment to really come, and then they'll make Firefly's failure even more thorough." Speaking of this, Eric smiled confidently with a hint of sarcasm and said, "But have they not considered that maybe the situation in their imagination will be completely reversed? At the current level of Firefly Group's development and competition with several other major film companies, some private tricks did not have much effect. In the final analysis, it was still a competition of the quality of the film. In this regard, Eric's advantage was absolutely incomparable. Not only that, Eric decisively handed over the daily management of Firefly Group to the more professional Katzenberg, Michael Lynn, and others. He devoted most of his energy to film production. It could be said that he played his advantage, incisively and vividly. In this case, the film produced in the original spacetime had proven its box office potential. Even if the box office did not reach the level of the original spacetime because of the butterfly effect, there was almost no possibility of a complete failure. Eric's words were like a reassuring pill to everyone present. Before this, Michael Lynn and others were influenced by the public opinion of the outside world and more or less had similar concerns. Their minds settled down, and they began to discuss the next countermeasures. The reason for the current situation, in addition to the expansion of Firefly Group's power squeezing the position of other film companies in the same industry, was also the influence of Firefly's other shareholders and Wall Street capital forces. Now was the most critical moment of Firefly Group's bond issuance. Once the $8 billion bond issuance was blocked, according to the additional terms when Firefly acquired ABC, Firefly would either choose to raise the interest rate or choose to reduce the bond issuance share, and the shortfall would continue to be paid with equity. No matter which of these two results, investors would be happy to see. Therefore, Katzenberg, who specially came back from New York, said, "Eric, when I was in New York, Tom Murphy asked me more than once about the cooperation between Firefly, Sony, and MGM. We can't change the established contract. But I think we should take back the distribution rights of Mission Impossible, Night at the Museum, and other films from Miss Barrymore. With the current situation in Colombia, there should not be much resistance. This can also greatly improve the confidence of those shareholders and creditors in the company, and there will be much less resistance to our bond issuance. In the past few years, Colombia had been in a mess under Peter Guber's management. At this time, there was not much resistance to finding a reason to take back the distribution rights, but many of Eric's plans would be interrupted. Colombia will not only bear 50% of the publicity cost of these films, but also only take 15% of the box office share. Even if we can squeeze out distribution resources from films such as Day of Independence and Jurassic Park 2, Firefly can't possibly offer such conditions, right? Katzenberg nodded helplessly. With the current average distribution cost of more than $40 million, if Colombia wanted to recoup the cost from the investment, they would need at least $130 million at the North American box office. Of course, this time Colombia got the overseas distribution rights and could also make some profits, but the videotapes and movie peripheral rights still belong to Flower Pictures. Of course, Flower Pictures would choose to cooperate with Firefly. Compared to the expected huge profits of hundreds of millions of US dollars from these blockbuster films, the fat meat was divided between Flower Pictures and Firefly. As one of the Big Seven, Colombia was reduced to drinking the soup, and this soup would definitely be pocketed by Peter Guber in the form of bonuses and other forms. Katzenberg felt that if he was the major shareholder of Colombia, he would definitely use all means to throw a manager like Peter Guber into jail. But the dreamy reality was that Sony was still very confident in this executive, and everyone in Hollywood knew that Colombia's mess was getting worse and worse. Eric, since the main problem now is to ensure the smooth issuance of the company's bonds, I think we just need some good news that can really stimulate the market. After Michael Lind said this, everyone at the meeting looked at Eric. Eric certainly knew what this group of people was thinking. He smiled and said, "It just so happens that I have written a good script recently, and I plan to invite Julia Roberts to be the female lead. Maybe I can release this news tomorrow." That's not enough. Frank Wales also said at this time, "Eric, you should be like Pretty Woman and direct it yourself. Since Jurassic Park last year, everyone is concerned about what your next film will be." Eric spread his hands and said helplessly, "But you know, I have other things to do. At most, I will be the producer myself." Katzenberg said, "Eric, I remember you said that for The Matrix, if you can announce this project at the same time, the effect will definitely be better." Eric thought for a while. The Matrix could also be put on the agenda now. He said, "No problem. You can go and prepare the press release later. I won't be attending the press conference. In the next few days, I need to check the production progress of all the projects at hand." After confirming this matter, Katzenberg briefly described the restructuring progress of ABC television network. The heads of the various departments also reported some trivial matters. Only then did the meeting end. On the way back to the Sharp Corner Manor, Eric accidentally fell asleep in the car. When he opened his eyes, he found that he was still leaning against the back seat of the car. However, the girl's warm and soft body was next to him, and the two of them were covered with a blanket. Whenever he returned to Los Angeles, Drew would always appear by his side immediately. Eric felt a warmth in his heart. They should be in the garage, but it must be dark outside. He felt inexplicably tired. Eric couldn't be bothered to check what time it was, nor did he mind being in the car. He planned to continue sleeping with the girl in his arms. However, perhaps because she felt his movement, Drew woke up. "Eric," she called lazily. As usual, the girl rubbed against him then complained, "It's so dark. Natasha, turn on the lights." In the dark, Eric couldn't help but smile. Just as he was about to remind her that they were in the car, after a light sound, the lights in the car lit up. Eric was surprised to find that there were two identical figures sitting in the front row. This was not the Mercedes-Benz he took back, but another white off-road vehicle. Eric didn't have the habit of collecting cars, but the little girl often bought some luxury cars when she was in the mood. Unknowingly, There were already more than 20 cars parked in the Manor's underground garage. Because they were rarely driven, most of them were new. Looking at the girl who was about to act coquettishly with a smile, Eric pinched her little ears and said, "Why do you let them sit in the front?" Drew smiled and said, "Do you want them to sit in the back row too?" "Yeah, then you can drive in the front row," Eric said helplessly. Then he opened the door and got out of the car. The girl and the twins also got out of the car. Eric looked at the unfamiliar off-road vehicle in front of him, kicked the tires, and asked, "Is this a Hummer? When did you like this kind of car?" "I bought it for you." Drew came over and held Eric's arm. She said, "It's a birthday gift." Eric just remembered that he had just celebrated his 24th birthday. He shrugged indifferently, walked out, and said, "I'm not a coal miner. Why do I need a Hummer?" Drew didn't understand what he meant by coal miner. She pouted at Eric and asked for praise. "This is a military vehicle. It's very sturdy." And then, Drew blinked and seemed to have realized. However, it was useless. Eric rarely drove himself now, let alone driving such a military vehicle. "If you don't like it, then forget it. I'll just change it for a birthday gift." Eric pretended to be curious and asked, "Oh, there's a backup, tell me about it." The girl pointed to the twins who were quietly following behind her. "Here are the two of them." Chapter 6:17. When Eric heard what the girl said, he raised his arm and knocked her on the head as usual. With so many things going on recently, he was not in the mood to deal with women, let alone two women who looked exactly the same. It was already past 8 o'clock in the evening. After returning to the villa, Eric sent the twins to prepare dinner. He checked the facts and took out the press release that Firefly's headquarters had prepared for tomorrow, as well as several other documents. Although Eric appeared to be confident in the meeting room, it was impossible for him to be completely free of worry. Paramount and Universal chose to release two heavyweight films before Saving Private Ryan at the same time. Their purpose was to give Firefly a head-on blow during the summer. Once Saving Private Ryan failed, under the influence of someone with ulterior motives, the subsequent two films would definitely be greatly affected. Eric put the press release aside and first looked at the box office data of the first two films in Paramount's Beverly Hills Detective series. Beverly Hills Detective, which was released in 1984, earned $230 million at the North American box office at a cost of $15 million, and was the box office champion that year. The follow-up, Beverly Hills Detective 2, also earned $150 million at the local box office. The latest film, Beverly Hills Detective 3, could be said to be the ambitious work of Viacom after acquiring Paramount. Although it was a black comedy without special effects and big scenes, Paramount still spent $50 million on the production cost, which was more than twice the investment of similar films. According to the box office curve of the second sequel and the growth of the Hollywood box office in recent years, Firefly's internal data analysis department estimated that the total box office of Beverly Hills Detective 3, on Wednesday and Thursday, plus the first 3 days of the first weekend, would exceed $50 million. At the same time, Universal's The Mummy was even more popular than Beverly Hills Detective 3. Although the total investment of this adventure film, which was similar to the Raiders of the Lost Ark series, was only $60 million. This was mainly because Nicole had used her salary as a shareholder, and the crew had gone to Morocco, North Africa to film, which greatly reduced expenses. Without these two measures to reduce costs, the production cost of The Mummy would not be less than $80 million. Combined with Universal's publicity model, trailers, and test screenings, the prediction department predicted that the box office would reach $50 million in the first 3 days. Although both companies used a saturation release strategy with a relatively large drop in the next week, based on the 40% drop in the next week of Beverly Hills Detective 3 and The Mummy, if the data in their hands didn't change too much, the box office for Saving Private Ryan in the first weekend would only be about 35 million yuan at most, and the box office for the first 7 days would only be about 50 million yuan. At the same time, after True Lies was released on the 10th of June, 4 heavyweight movies would gather together. In addition to the cannon fodder movie that had to share a portion of the box office. Although the weekly box office would hit a new high, the first week box office of True Lies was likely to be limited to $50 million. The next 2 weeks were Paramount's Star Trek VII, Warner's The Law Enforcement General, and Firefly's The Lion King. Both Star Trek VII and The Law Enforcement General were big variables. Eric only had a vague impression of Star Trek VII. Since he didn't have any special memories of it, it meant that this movie wasn't a big threat. Warner Pictures was stimulated by Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven's double box office awards. This summer, they ignored the overall weakness of Western films and released 2 blockbuster Western films. In addition to The Law Enforcement General, the other was the opening film of this summer's summer, Mahuali the Gambler, starring 2 big names, Mel Gibson and Jodie Foster. However, after the movie was released on the 20th of May, it only received $13 million in the first weekend, which was far below Warner Pictures' expectations. At the same time, it also withdrew from the competition of the summer box office. The Law Enforcement General was also a Western film that Kevin Costner had filmed last year. With the reputation that Kevin Costner had accumulated in Dances with Wolves, no one could be sure how The Law Enforcement General would turn out. Eric had no memory of this movie at all, so there were only 2 possibilities. One was that the movie was silently flopped in the original time and space. The other was that this was a brand new movie that was affected by the butterfly effect. Eric very much hoped that the result was the former, but looking at the $63 million budget of The Law Enforcement General and the primetime slot of June 24 given by Warner, Eric felt that the latter might be more likely. After all, the film company had accumulated years of experience. Before the movie was released, they could almost make a detailed assessment of the movie's quality and box office prospects. Although they often made mistakes, this assessment was like a weather forecast. There was no guarantee of accuracy, but the probability of a deviation in the general direction was not high. If The Law Enforcement General's box office results could really match its production cost and schedule, then The Lion King's box office would also be affected in an unpredictable way. Over the years, with the platform that Eric gave, Drew, who was very smart, definitely had 7 or 8 tails, even if she did not have 9 tails. However, the girl showed her smart side less and less around Eric. Of course, she was aware of the current situation. Seeing Eric frowning and pondering, the girl docilely moved over and said, "Eric, how about I return the distribution rights of Mission Impossible and Night at the Museum, as well as those copyrights to Firefly?" Drew's voice broke Eric's contemplation. Looking at the data analysis in his hand, Eric laughed self-deprecatingly. He had so many good cards in his hand. Even if he really lost this round, it would not affect too much. He could just make a comeback. Eric hugged the girl and kissed her white and tender face. He smiled and said, "Of course not. These are our little stash. We won't give it to anyone. By the way, how is the preparation for Forrest Gump?" The girl curled up in Eric's arms and said, "Hanks's salary has been settled. $8 million, but he hopes that we can provide enough resources for the Oscars in the future. In addition, Godfather also likes the script. Amy and I went to his house last week, and he especially helped us invite Robert Zemeckis. Robert has already agreed to take over the project." Tom Hanks's salary for signing Saving Private Ryan was $10 million. Eric knew that the reason why he lowered his salary was most likely because he saw Forrest Gump as a potential Oscars film. Hanks was about to turn 40, and his desire for an Oscar was even more urgent. If it were not for Saving Private Ryan, Hanks would probably have taken on Philadelphia Stories, just like in the original timeline. Although there was a deviation in history, with his outstanding performance in Saving Private Ryan and the following Forrest Gump, it was not impossible for him to repeat the miracle of winning 2 Oscars in a row. Hearing that the director, Robert Zemeckis, was helped by Spielberg, Eric was also curious and asked, "What film has Steven been preparing recently?" "No, Godfather is only the producer of a few films. I heard that he and David Geffen are planning to set up a new film studio. Just like the United Artists led by Chaplin. They will only be responsible for the production and not the distribution." Drew shook his head and said, "But I don't think this plan will work at all. If they don't do the distribution themselves, they will still be restrained by the Big Seven. Eric thought that in this timeline, with Jurassic Park in his hands and Katzenberg staying at Disney, Spielberg would not want to set up his own company. After hearing Drew's words, he realized that this matter should be led by the rich and powerful David Geffen. David Geffen had his own record and production company, with a net worth of more than $2 billion. Last year, he left Time Warner, and Eric rejected him to join Firefly. David Geffen probably had the idea of setting up a big film studio after that. Thinking of the last few words of his little girl, Eric asked, "You didn't say that in front of Steven, did you?" Drew chuckled and shook his head. "I'm not an idiot. Godfather is so excited that he wants to do something big. I'm just asking for a rebuff by saying something like that." Eric smiled. Although his little girl had become closer to Spielberg in recent years, it was not to the point where she would say such things. Although Eric slept for a while in the car, he quickly went to bed after eating the dinner prepared by the twins. The next day before dawn, Eric was awakened by a rapid ringing of the phone. He groggily touched the phone and put it to his ear. Katzenberg's excited voice immediately came through. "Eric, the company just received news. Can you imagine? $72 million, only $72 million, haha." Eric looked at his watch. It was not even 4 o'clock yet. He secretly sighed at Katzenberg's lunatic. Does a workaholic not need to sleep? He is so energetic. Eric quietly got out of bed and pulled the thin blanket over his little girl. Then he walked out of the bedroom with the cordless phone. Although he had already realized something, Eric asked again. "What one? $72 million? Of course it's the box office of the first day of Beverly Hills Detective 3. It's only $72 million, which is only 30% of the estimated $6 million on the first day. Paramount originally hoped that this sequel could hit $200 million at the box office, but now it seems that the total box office may not even reach $50 million. As long as The Mummy doesn't surpass the box office curve of Jurassic Park, our Ryan box office potential will not be suppressed." After hearing Katzenberg's confirmation, Eric instantly woke up. At the same time, he understood why Katzenberg was so energetic. Hearing a faint voice on the other end of the phone, Eric asked, "Jeffrey, are you at the company now?" "Of course, Michael is also on the way. I'm just informing you that you have other work to do today, so you don't have to come over. If there's anything, I'll call you immediately." Katzenberg then said. Paramount originally wanted to cover up this news. The manager on duty in the data department took more than 2 hours to get the exact data. "We are now contacting the media to further expand the influence of this news. Although the morning newspaper is a little late, ABC's morning news will focus on this news. There will also be special film review articles in the evening newspapers of major cities today. Even if Beverly Hills Detective 3 is only a temporary loss, we will not let it have any chance to make a comeback." After hanging up the phone, Eric's mood suddenly relaxed. As Katzenberg had just said, even if Beverly Hills Detective 3 was only a temporary box office loss, the subsequent one-sided bad reviews would make the movie have no chance to make a comeback. Although Universal and Paramount had a faint intention of jointly targeting Firefly, Eric believed that Universal must be doing the same thing. After dawn, there would be a lot of negative news about Beverly Hills Detective 3 in the media. The dismal box office of Beverly Hills Detective 3, on the first day of Beverly Hills Detective 3, gave Paramount no reason to refute. Once it failed in the United States, as a black comedy with a bad reputation, the overseas box office would be even more hopeless. Although Hollywood's current comprehensive statistics only accounted for 30% of the total box office revenue, and other peripheral revenue was as high as 70%, that was only if the quality of the movie was good. Once Beverly Hills Detective 3 failed in both box office and reputation, it would form a domino effect. Then no one would be interested in this movie in the video and television markets. According to the North American box office of Beverly Hills Detective 3, this comedy, which cost nearly $100 million to produce and distribute, could eventually cause Paramount a loss of no less than $50 million. For Lei Sherdong, who was ambitious and wanted to make a name for himself in Hollywood, this loss was enough to make his heart ache for a long time. Next, there was only The Mummy left. Even if The Mummy was a small hit, it would no longer suppress Saving Private Ryan. As long as Saving Private Ryan performed at a normal box office level, under the guidance of Firefly, it would be able to form a positive competitive relationship with True Lies in terms of reputation and box office. The failure of Beverly Hills Detective 3 was like the opponent suddenly losing an important chess piece in a game of chess. Firefly immediately regained the initiative. In his excitement, Eric didn't have any intention of going back to sleep. He put on his clothes and went downstairs in advance. He went to his basement study to deal with some of the emails that had accumulated yesterday. When the sun rose outside the window, he left the study and planned to exercise. As soon as the automatic door of the study opened, Eric saw the twins walking down the stairs side by side. The two sisters were wearing the same black tank top and shorts, which made their slender waists and long legs look even fairer. Their blonde hair was tied into a ponytail, their oval faces were delicate and round, and their blue eyes looked big even without eyeshadow. Their nose and mouth were very small, and their thin eyebrows and thin lips had a different kind of purity. Seeing Eric suddenly appear after the automatic door opened, the twins stopped in their tracks and shouted in unison, "Boss!" Chapter 6:18. Eric saw that the twins were dressed to go for morning exercise, so he nodded and said, "Just in time, accompany me to the gym." Eric was about to walk out after he finished speaking, but the twins looked at each other and didn't move. Eric asked in confusion, "What's wrong?" One of the girls hesitated and said, "Boss doesn't allow us to accompany you to the gym." The boss this time was probably referring to Drew. Eric was still stunned for a moment, before he understood. When the girl said that Drew didn't allow them to accompany him to the gym, she probably meant that he didn't allow them to fight with him. After all, he would only be beaten up in the boxing ring. Eric certainly didn't like to torture himself, so he laughed and said, "You want to beat me up, but I don't want to. I mean, you can accompany me to run, play basketball, or something else." Only then did the twins follow him quietly. Eric looked at the two gentle and harmless girls and joked as he walked. "Drew is your boss. I'm the owner of this manor, so you should call me master." Although the twins' English hadn't improved much after so long, it wasn't to the extent that they couldn't understand the meaning behind Eric's words. However, the twins didn't hesitate and said in unison, "Yes, master." Eric had always been a little puzzled by the twins' psychological state. When he heard the two girls call him master without hesitation, and the two girls' calm reaction when the little girl casually said that she wanted to give them to him as birthday gifts, he felt even more puzzled. After the morning exercise, Eric took advantage of the time when the twins went to make breakfast to ask the little girl, who had just woken up, this question. "It's very simple because I bought them." The little girl's mouth was full of foam from brushing her teeth. She said vaguely and winked at Eric playfully, "You can go and try the Polly in the kitchen now. They'll definitely be very obedient, and they're still virgins." Eric leaned against the door of the room and glared at the girl. He asked, "What's the reason?" Drew rinsed his mouth, washed his face, and began to do facial care. He said, "They were originally sold to the United States. If I hadn't spent money to buy them from Sean Kim, they would have been crippled even if they hadn't died in the underground boxing ring. Many people like to see this kind of scene. Moreover, even if they survive, their fate would be nothing more than to fall into some unsightly technical institute. There was never a lack of beautiful things in this world, but under the influence of money and power, they became the victims of some people's dark desires." With the rise of his status, Eric was gradually able to come into contact with these corners of the world that ordinary people could not see. Hearing Drew's words, he only shook his head gently. The girl rubbed her face cream, glanced at Eric's expression and said, "So not only did I save their lives, but I also gave them a life that they didn't dare to imagine before. I also helped their family escape from Moscow, a place where they can't even fill their stomachs. What reason do they have to refuse my request?" "Oh," Eric dragged his voice and nodded. He said, "Is that all?" "Hee hee," the little girl giggled. She didn't mind temporarily showing her surly side in front of Eric. She said, "I just told them very bluntly that if I'm not satisfied, they can be returned to Sean Kim." If they were returned, it meant that the twins would once again suffer the tragic fate that the girl had just mentioned. Eric sighed in his heart. He walked over and hugged the girl's soft waist. He said, "You won't do that, right?" The girl twisted her body and turned around. She hugged Eric's body and said, "If you don't let me do that, I won't do that." Eric patted the girl's back and said, "It seems that I have to control you properly, lest you go out and harm the world." The girl knocked her chin on Eric's shoulder and said in a soft voice, "Eric, you are my world. I don't care about anyone else." The dismal box office of US $1.72 million on the first day of Beverly Hills Detective 3 was like a basin of cold water that extinguished the wild ambition of many people who wanted to join forces to snipe the Fireflies. In the fierce competition in Hollywood, there was no lack of situations where everyone would push someone who was down. Then, the media's one-sided negative reviews reduced the box office of Beverly Hills Detective 3 to an even more miserable US $1.5 million the next day. The total box office of US $3.22 million in the first 2 days was only a fraction of Paramount's original estimate of US $12 million. Even outside of Hollywood, many people saw the obvious change in the situation. In the next few days, Eric received a lot of emails expressing goodwill. On the same day that the box office of Beverly Hills Detective 3 was released, Firefly Group released their plans for the Matrix series and Eric's Runaway Bride, tailor-made for Julia after Pretty Woman. Firefly's long-term bond sales immediately increased by 50%, and the total sales reached US $200 million. As long as the situation didn't change too much, the bond distribution plan that Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank originally planned to complete in 3 months could be completed in 2 months. On May 27, Universal Pictures' The Mummy was released in 3,100 theaters in North America, breaking the record of Jurassic Park last year. Universal Pictures even applied for a Guinness World Record for this gimmick. Because Beverly Hills Detective 3 was completely swept into the corner, the box office of The Mummy achieved a small explosion on its first day, reaching US $16.9 million. The box office of Beverly Hills Detective 3 was only US $4.5 million in the first day. The Mummy received US $18.1 million and US $16.3 million in the next 2 days. Although the box office of US $51 million in the first 3 days was higher than the industry and Universal's internal estimates, Universal was the most excited. As long as Saving Private Ryan didn't form a situation where there were 2 strong films attacking Saving Private Ryan, Firefly didn't feel too much pressure. Even Jurassic Park couldn't withstand a 40% drop in the box office after its successful release last year. The Mummy was estimated to be US $75 million in the first week, and the box office of the next week would definitely fall back to the range of US $40 million to US $50 million. The highest weekly box office in North America was US $170 million, and the themes of the 2 films were completely different. The box office of The Mummy next week wouldn't have much of an impact on Saving Private Ryan. With this matter settled, Eric put down the worries in his heart and began to focus on the production of the film in his hands. He now had control over a batch of the most heavyweight films in Hollywood: Jurassic Park 2, Day of Independence, Toy Story 2, Face/Off, etc., Mission Impossible series, Night at the Museum series, and Forrest Gump from Flower Pictures. Game of the Brave and Mr. and Mrs. Smith 2 were the last 2 films that Firefly collaborated with Columbia. Thunderbolts series with DreamWorks, Resident Evil, and other films. Firefly also participated in part of MGM's upcoming James Bond, The Golden Eye. Although Fox's Braveheart did not have any financial involvement with Firefly, it was certain that Eric would eventually be dragged by Elizabeth for a free consultation. The production progress of these films was different. Some were in post-production editing, and some were still in the script revision stage. Eric only had time to check the progress of the special effects on Game of the Brave and discuss the post-production work in detail with the director of Mission Impossible, Brian De Palma, who had just finished filming. It was already June 3rd. After a huge premiere, Saving Private Ryan officially opened in 2,700 theaters in North America. As a war film with the theme of commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landing of World War II, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and other major European countries also opened the simultaneous release mode for the first time. There were a total of 29 countries releasing the film at the same time worldwide. The real and tragic Normandy landing scene, the value debate of 8 people saving 1 person, the growth and struggle of the small characters in the war. As soon as Saving Private Ryan was released, a lot of discussion about the film appeared in the media. Many box office analysis agencies had a general conclusion that the final box office of a film was usually proportional to the popularity of the film. When the media began to dig deeper into the female director, Kathryn Bigelow, the popularity of Saving Private Ryan also reached a peak. Firefly originally planned to use Kathryn and Cameron's ex-wife relationship to promote the film. For this reason, they deliberately changed the 2-week gap between the release of Firefly's films and set the release date of True Lies 1 week after Saving Private Ryan. However, after The Hollywood Reporter published an article questioning whether Kathryn could really shoot such a realistic war film like Saving Private Ryan like a man, other media outlets reposted and followed the discussion. This topic quickly provoked a backlash from feminist groups in North America and even Europe. The plan could not keep up with the changes. Firefly's original intention of Saving Private Ryan and True Lies to form a positive box office competition was also declared a failure. However, this result did not affect the box office of Saving Private Ryan at all. Instead, due to a large number of female audiences who were originally not interested in war films suddenly joining the ranks of support, the box office of Saving Private Ryan soared. After the first weekend's box office of $42 million in 3 days, the war film once again won $31 million in 4 days with an unstoppable momentum. The total box office of $73 million in the first week was $25 million more than Firefly's estimate. According to statistics, most of the box office was due to the sudden addition of female audiences. When True Lies was released in the second week, this trend showed no signs of cooling down. It seemed that some feminists who suddenly noticed the relationship between Cameron and Kathryn even publicly published advertisements at their own expense in the newspapers, urging their female friends to continue supporting Saving Private Ryan in an attempt to trample True Lies under their feet. Moreover, these initiatives seemed to be working. The box office of True Lies was $37 million in the first weekend. Although Saving Private Ryan did not surpass the box office of Saving Private Ryan, it was only less than $1 million behind True Lies. It was really difficult to determine who would win the box office in the end. While Eric and the other senior executives of Firefly were excited about the box office explosion of Saving Private Ryan, they could not help but have a thought in their minds. Don't mess with women. If they can make a movie's box office rise by 50%, they can definitely make a movie's box office fall by 50%. At the same time, Eric was also secretly glad that True Lies was a completely male-oriented film. If it was a film targeted at female audiences, then the ending this time would definitely be very miserable. The box office of True Lies was finally fixed at $51 million in the first week, barely surpassing the $49 million of Saving Private Ryan in the second week. Although it was not as good as The Mummy and Saving Private Ryan in the first 2 weeks, it was still in line with Firefly's original expectations. The outstanding box office performance of the 2 movies made the voices that were originally pessimistic about Firefly's summer performance completely disappear without a trace. Even if the box office performance of The Lion King was not good, no one would jump out to question the strength of Firefly Group. Under such circumstances, Katzenberg, who returned to New York again, had less resistance to the restructuring of ABC. After another expansion, the Firefly Cineplex in Praia Vista appeared to be even more bustling and prosperous. During the busy working hours, most people were hurriedly shuttling back and forth, as if they were indifferent to everything outside. However, when a few buses slowly drove into the Cineplex, they still attracted a lot of attention in an instant. When the 5 buses stopped outside a huge studio that had just been built and had not yet been opened, they even attracted a crowd of onlookers. After all, although they were used to seeing too many beautiful women in Hollywood, not many people had seen beautiful women in cars. Looking at a group of tall and curvy women walking out of the bus, many of the onlookers couldn't help but swallow their saliva. However, these people didn't even have time to express their opinions before they were dispelled by a tough security guard. In fact, when some of the staff in the Cineplex were envious of them, the models who got out of the buses also looked at the huge studio around them with longing eyes. For models who usually only had a few years of professional life, if they could find a place for themselves in Hollywood, even if they couldn't become famous, they could find a good husband to marry. What's more, if they could meet the big shot who was about to appear this time, they would have endless luxury for the rest of their lives. Chapter 6:19. According to Eric's project plan, the Victoria's Secret show had to be broadcast before the winter break of the TV series in early December. This way, not only could it achieve the best ratings and advertising effect, but it could also lead to a wave of sales during the New Year's consumer season. The annual show also needed a month of post-production from recording to broadcasting. Because it was the first time such a large-scale annual show was held, the preliminary preparations and rehearsals also needed several months of sufficient preparation. Therefore, although it was only late June, the project had already started. This way, Eric could more leisurely arrange his time among other busy affairs. Studio number 11 in Firefly Studios, which had not yet been officially opened, had been set up as a project studio according to Eric's request. At this time, Eric was in a small conference room separated from the studio. He was introducing the entire plan for the Victoria's Secret show to Emily Brighton and other LTD executives who had come from New York, as well as his own production team. The entire Victoria's Secret show is actually equivalent to a large-scale advertising film. The audience we are facing this time is neither the fashion magazine editors, nor the purchasing directors of chain stores, but all the ordinary audience in front of the TV. We can't expect ordinary people to be able to tell how good a model's tablecloth is, nor can we expect them to determine the market prospects of a set of internal design, only by observing its design style. What we need to do is to give them what they want to see. Exquisite and perfect bodies, gorgeous and gorgeous stage, bright and catchy music. My purpose is to turn the Victoria's Secret show into the Oscars of the fashion industry. Only the most outstanding supermodels can appear on this stage. I want everyone to think of supermodels and associate them with the Victoria's Secret show, not a title given by a few fashion magazines casually. After Eric's brief introduction, the LTD executives and Eric's production team raised their own questions. Eric patiently answered them one by one. After more than an hour of discussion, they had a general understanding of the effect Eric wanted. Unknowingly, there was a lot of chatter outside the conference room. A staff member knocked on the door and came in saying, "Mr. Williams, Miss Brighton, the models have arrived." "Well, that's all for today. I will find time to discuss the details with you." Eric clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Of course, if you want to see the beauties, you can also stay. The beauties outside are definitely the most beautiful in the world." Everyone laughed and got up. Eric's production team now had their own work to do. Of course, it was impossible for them to stay. Even several senior executives of LTD had flown over from the headquarters. After this meeting, they would immediately return to New York and other places. In the end, in addition to Eric and Emily, there was also the creative director of Victoria's Secret, Edward Razek, whom Eric had specially named. Edward Razek had been in charge of the production of the Victoria's Secret show since 1992. However, in Eric's opinion, the Victoria's Secret show's real maturity should be after 2007 and 2008. Before that, most of the shows were in the stage of exploration. Before 2000, the Victoria's Secret show was basically no different from an ordinary fashion show. This time, Eric planned to directly use the program model of the Victoria's Secret show after 2010. However, he couldn't be in charge of this project all the time. Edward Razek, the producer in the original Spacetime, could be involved in the operation of the entire project. In the future, the Victoria's Secret show could also be handed over to him. After the people attending the meeting gradually left, Emily asked the main creative team members to go out and prepare for the time being. Only Eric and Edward Razek were left behind. Then, she took out a prepared document and handed it to Eric. She said, "This is the list of 40 people that Edward and I have privately selected. A few of them are internal models that we have signed. The rest are from other modeling agencies. This time, Elite and Ford alone sent over 80 people. There are also people from other agencies. A total of 150 candidates. LTD works very closely with these agencies. We can't afford to offend them at all. So, on the surface, we promise to let you choose personally. During the audition later, you can pay attention to these people. In addition, if you think the other models are good, you can adjust them at any time." Eric had originally only asked Emily to prepare a team of about 40 people. He was a little surprised that so many people suddenly appeared. However, after knowing the reason, Eric just nodded casually. The fashion industry and the modeling industry had always been closely linked. A mid-range fashion brand like LTD really didn't want to provoke industry giants like Elite Model Agency and Ford Model Management Company, so as to avoid being criticized in the future during the production of advertisements. However, these things weren't a problem for Eric. When Eric opened the list, Emily said, "There's also the matter of the spokespersons. Of the 5 spokespersons you proposed, we have signed Linda Evangelista and Christy Turlington. Cindy Crawford and Naomi Campbell have also expressed interest in the spokesperson of Victoria's Secret. However, they don't want to waste too much time on this big show, especially Cindy Crawford. I heard that she has signed a big production contract with Warner. There's not much time left for the show." The 1990 issue of Vogue magazine published the photos of the 5 most influential fashion models, and for the first time, the title of supermodel was publicly used. The names that Emily had just mentioned were 4 of the 5. The last German supermodel, Tagana Partes, had already retired. Originally, Claudia Schiff would have filled the gap left by Tagana Partes. However, because of Eric's appearance, Claudia had given up her modeling career and smoothly transferred to Hollywood. Although these supermodels were popular in the fashion industry, Eric didn't care too much about them. The Victoria's Secret show had originally been nicknamed the Terminator of the supermodel era. Many fashion people in the future criticized the Victoria's Secret show for lowering the value of supermodels and reducing them to sensationalism. However, at the same time, no one dared to deny that it was difficult for models who didn't appear in the Victoria's Secret show to gain the title of supermodel. Moreover, in the model's annual income ranking in the previous world, the top 10 models were basically models who walked out of the Victoria's Secret show. Hearing Emily's words, Eric said, "Since the 2 of them don't want to participate in the show, then forget it. We can train the other 3 spokespersons ourselves." Edward said, "Eric, maybe we can ignore Naomi Campbell, but I think it's best to talk to Miss Cindy Crawford again. She's the most popular supermodel." Eric closed the roster and said to Edward with a smile, "Edward, you have to remember that from now on, the most popular supermodel in the Victoria's Secret show will have real popularity. Since they've given up this opportunity, then they'll never want to step on this stage again." After finishing his words, Eric picked up the roster and walked out. Emily purposely stopped and waited for Eric to leave the room. Then she said to Edward, who was a little embarrassed, "Edward, don't mind him. Sometimes this guy is so self-righteous, but most of the time, the results prove that he's right." Of course, Edward didn't mind. He didn't think he had the right to mind a big shot like Eric. Hearing Emily's comfort, Edward couldn't help but ask, "Emily, is what you told me a few days ago true?" "What?" Emily was stunned, but she quickly remembered and nodded. "Of course it's true. Although Eric can be the director this year, he can't do it all the time. He seems to hate doing certain things over and over again. He didn't even want to direct Jurassic Park 2 himself. So next year's fashion show will probably be under your control. So you'd better cheer up and remember every detail about that guy." After receiving a definite answer, Edward Razek finally calmed down. He said, Emily, if it weren't for Naomi Campbell and Cindy Crawford, do you think we would have been able to get Miss Claudia Schiffer back on stage? She's a top model, and now she's much more popular than all the other models. That's a good idea, but it's unlikely. Claudia Schiffer now spends most of her time in Hollywood, and her salary has increased to $5 million. It's unlikely that she'll waste a few months of her schedule on a fashion show. Edward revealed a flirtatious smile and lowered his voice. If it's us, of course, it's impossible. But what if Eric comes out and greets her? Emily was stunned, and then her eyes lit up. She said, "That's a good idea. I'll give it a try later." While talking about this matter, Edward and Emily walked out of the conference room together. After hesitating for a while, Edward found an excuse to go to the bathroom and went to a secluded place to make a call. Different from the actor's audition room, the model's audition room was more like a professional studio. In order to show the model's stage effects more directly, the spacious room was full of backdrops, filler lights, and soft lighting boxes. Eric felt as if he had returned to his previous life when he worked in an advertising company to shoot print ads. But this time, he didn't need to do it himself. He only needed to say a word, and someone would pick up the best models in the world and choose them at will. In the thick roster, in addition to the 2 confirmed supermodels, there were also some familiar names from his previous life, such as Heidi Klum, Tara Banks, Kate Moss, and so on. Compared to the first few years, Eric was now immune to beautiful women. After all, if something was too easy to get, it would inevitably make people lose interest in pursuing it. Perhaps this was the reason why there was such a high proportion of homosexuals in Hollywood and the fashion industry. Hearing Emily's idea of letting Claudia return to the runway, Eric nodded. "That's a good idea. I'll contact Claudia and see if she has any free time. If she doesn't, then forget about it." Emily said, "You said it yourself. Do you think she won't have any free time?" Eric shrugged. "I'm trying to be a considerate lover, not a tyrant." "Oh, then your lovers are really lucky," Emily teased. She then said, "How many months has it been since you went to New York to visit Kevin and Shashia?" Eric retorted, "A woman in her 30s who doesn't want to get married or have children has no right to criticize me." There were staff members all around them, and the 2 of them stopped their bickering at the same time. Since most of the names had already been decided, the so-called interview was actually just a formality. Not to mention those bold and teasing eyes, many accidental bras that fell to the ground also made everyone in the audition room a little feast for the eyes. When another group of models left, Emily finally couldn't help but complain. "What do they think this is? They don't have to be so impatient to get rich guys, right?" Eric turned to a page and said, "Can you not look at me when you say the word rich guy?" Emily gave Eric a sideways glance and said, "Don't blame me for not reminding you, Eric. None of these chicks in the circle are easy to deal with. If you mess around with them, they definitely won't mind exposing your performance in bed and your size in gossip magazines in order to increase their fame." "Well, you've successfully scared me." Eric also made a little dirty joke. Emily snorted and then asked the staff to call the next group of models in. 3 tall figures in the new Victoria's Secret lingerie filed in. Eric immediately noticed the blonde beauty standing in the middle. He flipped through the list of names under the information, but he didn't find her name. Edward Razek asked the 3 models to introduce themselves according to the routine. He walked around the tablecloth and then began to ask some questions. Eric held a document in front of Emily and whispered, "Why isn't Diane Kruger on the list? She was the winner of the 1992 Elite Model Competition in Germany. She should be very good in all aspects, right?" Emily glanced at the photo, and then looked up to admire Diane Kruger's tablecloth for a moment. She lowered her head again and said, "She was indeed on the list, but we eliminated her according to your original request." Eric was confused for a moment. "My request?" Chapter 620. Emily stretched out her finger and drew a line on Diane Kruger's measurements. "Have you forgotten? You specifically asked us to pay attention to their figures when choosing models." Eric glanced at the A-cup remark at the end of the data, and then looked up at Diane Kruger. who was standing in the middle of the room with a slightly reserved expression. Although Diane Kruger's facial lines were a bit stiff in his memory, most of them were images of her in her 30s. Most Western women's facial contours would change as they grew older. At this time, Diane Kruger had just turned 18. Although she had tied her blonde hair into a bun to make herself look more mature, her petite and round face still had an obvious youthfulness. However, it was this youthfulness that attracted Eric. Edward Razek skillfully went through the interview process, and then looked at the two big bosses who had been whispering to each other. Because he was sitting right next to them, he probably heard that Eric was very interested in one of the three models. Eric noticed Edward Razek's inquisitive look. He waved his hand and called a stylist over. Then, under the envious eyes of the other two models, the stylist took Diane Kruger, who was slightly excited, to the temporary dressing room on the side. After the two groups of models were interviewed, the stylist took Diane Kruger out of the dressing room again. Diane Kruger's brand new look made everyone in the room feel excited. Her loose hair made her small face look even more petite and lovely. The bright red lip gloss had been completely wiped away, revealing her pink lips. The youthfulness and vitality of an 18-year-old girl were undeniably in full bloom. Eric said to Emily, who was also surprised, "Look, this girl has a kind of sweetness and innocence. She also has a natural and delicate temperament that makes people want to protect her. This kind of girl will definitely be popular. I think she can even be trained as one of the 5 spokespersons for Victoria's Secret." Before anyone else in the audition room could react to Eric's words, the nervous Diane Kruger covered her mouth in excitement. During this period of time, the hottest topic in the fashion circle was that Eric Williams would personally create an annual fashion show for his Ltd brand. Although some big shots in the circle would occasionally mock Eric in a sour tone, questioning his fashion vision and so on. However, all the models, including their management companies, knew that this was a great opportunity for them to become famous. For modeling agencies, this was a great platform to promote the models under the red flag. For the models themselves, this opportunity was even more precious. If they could participate in this show, not only would their fame rise rapidly, they would also receive more opportunities for activities and endorsements. It was also possible for them to step into the Hollywood circle like Claudia Schiffer. The 5 spokespersons for Victoria's Secret became the focus of the public relations of the modeling agencies. Everyone knew that these 5 spokespersons would receive more resources. Most people also thought that this opportunity would definitely fall to the top of the fashion circle, such as Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, and so on. Diane Kruger had just been asked to stay by Eric. Although she was sure that she would definitely get the opportunity to walk in this show, she had never dared to expect to be invited as a spokesperson for Victoria's Secret. Therefore, when she heard Eric's words, Diane Kruger was so happy that she almost fell to the ground. Although Emily and Edward Razek had not yet expressed their opinions, since Eric had said so, everyone in the audition room knew that this matter was set in stone. The makeup artist who had helped Diane Kruger just now noticed that she seemed to be a little unstable, so he very sensibly came over to support her. This matter was completely under Eric's control. After hearing Eric's judgment, Emily and Edward Razek certainly did not object. When Diane Kruger calmed down, Eric smiled and asked, "So, Miss Kruger, are you willing to accept the invitation to be the spokesperson for Victoria's Secret?" Diane Kruger nodded incoherently and said, "Yes, Mr. Williams. Of course, I'm very willing." "Then, I hope you and your agent can wait for a moment. After the interview, we will talk about the contract in detail." After Diane Kruger left the room, Emily shook her head and said, "Eric, this girl is indeed not bad, but don't you think that her psychological quality is a little weak?" Eric knew that Emily was referring to Diane Kruger's loss of composure. He tapped on Diane Kruger's information and said, "Emily, not everyone's life is as smooth as yours. Take this girl for example. She comes from an ordinary small town in Germany. She has neither experience nor background. If she doesn't meet with a special opportunity, she might disappear from the fashion industry in a few years. Then she'll get married and have children. She'll become a nobody. This opportunity can be said to have changed her life. No matter how excited she is, it's not too much. I remember when Home Alone was a box office success. Occasionally, I would have the urge to cry. Emily waved her hand and said, Okay. You're right. But you have fame and wealth at the age of 18 that others might not even get in their lifetime. What's there to cry about? Compared to you, others should be crying, right? Eric smiled and didn't answer. Instead, he asked the next group of models to come in. Although it was just a formality, the interview didn't end until 6 o'clock. Eric had made some adjustments to the list that Emily had given him, and had initially decided on the other two spokespersons, Diane Kruger and Tara Banks, besides Linda Evangelista and Christy Turlington. Tara Banks had been given this opportunity not only because of her own qualifications, but also because of proper governance. After all, if all 5 spokespersons were white, there would definitely be a controversy in the future. The last spokesperson hadn't been decided yet. Emily and Edward Razek both favored Claudia, but Eric still needed to confirm whether Claudia's schedule was suitable. It was already evening by the time the interview ended. Eric left the discussion with Diane Kruger to Emily and Edward Razek. He changed his clothes in the temporary dressing room and left the studio in a hurry. That night was the celebration party for True Lies. Although True Lies had been severely suppressed by Saving Private Ryan, the movie was still very successful. The routine celebration party was inevitable. Chapter 6:21. In the third week of June, Paramount Pictures' Star Trek VII was released. Although this $35 million sci-fi film was adapted from a classic American sci-fi TV series, it did not seem to satisfy the audience's visual needs. It only grossed $23 million in the first 3 days of its first weekend, ranking between the first place True Lies and the third place Saving Private Ryan. It did not seem to be able to compete with the two blockbusters at all. Although the cumulative box office of The Mummy had reached $160 million in the fourth week of its release, its box office potential had basically been exhausted, and it had lost its threat to True Lies and Saving Private Ryan. Moreover, the possibility of The Lion King, on June 27, having an impact on the two live-action movies was very small. After all, the audience for live-action movies and animated movies were very different. Moreover, True Lies and Saving Private Ryan were both R-rated movies. The possibility of them influencing each other was even lower. At first, Eric was worried that the $63 million Western Law Enforcement would become an obstacle for True Lies and Saving Private Ryan to reap the box office. However, compared to The Lion King, which had a small test screening, Law Enforcement had a good reputation. Although Law Enforcement also held a test screening, the entire film industry was silent. Under such circumstances, anyone with a little common sense would know what had happened. Law Enforcement definitely did not have a good reputation. However, under Warner's PR, the film critics did not reveal this news before the film was released on a large scale. Therefore, Eric confirmed a certain guess that he had been hesitating about. Law Enforcement should not be a new film caused by the butterfly effect. Instead, it should have flopped silently in the original space-time. Under such circumstances, Eric did not have any worries. After the box office of True Lies was released at the end of the second week, Firefly held a lively celebration party at the Sunset Tower Hotel in Beverly Hills. Because the interview for the Victoria's Secret Angel ended at 6 in the evening, Eric went directly to the Sunset Tower Hotel from Playa Vista. True Lies was still in theaters, so this celebration banquet was quite high profile. Not only was there a red carpet, but a large number of reporters were also invited to continue to promote the movie's box office. Eric had set off a little late, and there was a traffic jam on the way. When he arrived at the Sunset Tower Hotel, it was already 7:15. The invited reporters thought that there would be no more stars, so they had planned to leave. However, when they saw Eric, they all rushed over. Fortunately, the invited reporters were very well behaved, and they didn't ask any sensitive questions because of Eric's current identity. Eric patiently accepted the interview and walked into the hotel. Some of the executives of Firefly and the crew of True Lies had already come out to greet him. After greeting everyone, Eric came to Cameron. Just as he was about to tease him about Saving Private Ryan, he saw Linda Hamilton beside Cameron. He didn't bring up the topic. He just greeted her warmly, and everyone walked to the banquet hall together. After a busy day of work, Eric didn't have much energy to socialize with others. After a few words with some guests who took the initiative to talk to him, Eric came to the Camerons and said to Linda Hamilton, "Linda, can you lend me Jim? We have some things to discuss." Of course, Linda Hamilton raised her glass to Eric and walked away. Eric could see that Cameron and Linda Hamilton were no longer as passionate as before. In his memory, the two of them delayed their marriage until 1997, but the marriage only lasted for a year and a half before they broke up. However, Eric didn't know if Cameron would be able to meet Susie Amos, the woman whose personality was most compatible with his. Cameron followed Eric's gaze and looked at Linda Hamilton's back as she left. He sighed inexplicably. Women. Eric could tell that Cameron's sigh was definitely not directed at Linda Hamilton alone. He smiled and said, "You didn't really suffer a blow, did you?" "Of course not," Cameron immediately denied. However, he hesitated and said, "I went to watch that movie. Catherine did a great job in it." "All right, let's not talk about her." Eric patted Cameron's shoulder. "Since you lost this time, you'll win it back next time. So, when do you plan to start preparing for Titanic?" Cameron thought for a while and said, "Linda and I plan to go to Hawaii for a vacation next month. We can start preparing at the end of the year. However, Eric, I think that 70 million is definitely not enough. So this time, why don't we directly raise the production cost to 100 million US dollars? That way, I can better arrange the funds." Eric held his chin and pretended to hesitate for a while before he reluctantly said, "I can promise you that. Anyway, you're almost used to burning so much money every time you make a movie. However, it's only 100 million US dollars. This time, we definitely can't overspend. You should know that Firefly Group is no longer mine alone. If we overspend, those shareholders will definitely jump out and criticize us." Cameron privately calculated that the production cost was 150 million US dollars. However, there had never been a movie with such a high cost in Hollywood. He felt that if he brought it up, Eric would definitely reject it on the spot. He might even cut off the project. Cameron had been thinking more and more about the production of Titanic recently. He definitely did not want to see the project cut off. Therefore, Cameron calculated in his heart. First, he would raise the production cost to 100 million US dollars with Eric. After that, it was not up to him. If they ran out of money halfway through the filming, other than continuing to add more, what else could they do? They could not let a project that had already cost 100 million US dollars be left unfinished. Therefore, when Eric said that, Cameron readily agreed. He even patted his chest and promised solemnly, "Absolutely no problem, Eric. This time, I promise that I won't overspend again. Otherwise, I won't take a single cent of my director's salary." The two unscrupulous fellows had their own little schemes and quickly discussed the specific plans of the project in a serious manner. They even pulled Cameron's producer partner, John Landau, over. When Eric and Cameron were discussing this matter, no one tactfully came over to disturb them. However, after the topic of Titanic, just as they parted ways, Eric saw a couple walking towards him. Eric sized up the tall woman with a beauty mole at the corner of her lips with great interest. He knew that it was definitely not a coincidence. However, he quickly withdrew his gaze and greeted the middle-aged man with a big beard beside the woman. Compared to the woman, Eric paid more attention to the fat man who resembled Harvey Weinstein, Joe Silver. Although producers like Jerry Bruckheimer and John Landau were more famous in Hollywood, when it came to status, at least before the new century, there was absolutely no one who could surpass Joe Silver in the producer circle. His Silver Productions had participated in the development of the Lethal Weapon series, Die Hard with a Dragon series, the Matrix series, Swordfish Operation, V for Vendetta, and many other well-known action movies. Moreover, in the mid-80s, Joe Silver was one of the important candidates for Disney's CEO. Although he did not win over Michael Eisner in the end, it was enough to prove that this person was extremely powerful in Hollywood. "Good evening, Joe. Long time no see." Eric took the initiative to greet Joe Silver. He extended his hand and greeted Joe Silver warmly. Joe Silver shook hands with Eric and said with a laugh, "Good evening, Eric. Congratulations on your Firefly having 2 more box office bombs this year." Eric let go of Joe Silver's big hand and took a glass of champagne from the waiter. He asked, "What about you? What movie have you been busy with recently?" It was only then that Joe Silver seemed to remember something. He pointed at the woman with the mole beside him and said, "My production company has been working on a gunfight movie recently. This is my female lead, Miss Cindy Crawford." Eric raised his glass to Cindy Crawford and said with a smile, "Congratulations, Miss Crawford. Joe's movie will definitely make you famous." "Thank you, Mr. Williams." Cindy Crawford had already freed her right hand that was holding the wine glass. Seeing that Eric had no intention of shaking hands with her, she had no choice but to change the glass back. She had always been the center of attention. She had thought that Eric, the legendary playboy, would definitely pounce on her without hesitation. However, the somewhat cold reactions from Eric and Joe Silver beside him made her feel frustrated for the first time. Then, without hesitation, Eric said something that made her feel even more frustrated. "Miss Crawford, can I talk to Joe alone?" Cindy Crawford suppressed the anger in her heart and maintained her charming smile. She said, "Okay, no problem." After Cindy Crawford left, Joe Silver joked, "Eric, there's no need to be angry with a woman who's not worth mentioning. It's not like you can't find enough beautiful women for your runway show. I heard that Firefly Studios has gathered a group of the world's top models today. It's enough to dazzle you." Eric spread his hands and did not mind Joe Silver's teasing. He smiled and said, "I'm a young man. It's normal for me to throw a tantrum. Besides, since this woman has already gotten the female lead of a big production movie, she's still unwilling to let go of the opportunity to be Victoria's Secret spokesperson. This seems a little greedy. I don't like greedy women." Joe Silver smiled noncommittally. There were too many people in Hollywood who hoped that Eric was just a young and impetuous man. However, no one would be so naive to think that it was the truth. After thinking about it, Joe Silver's eyes had a hint of slyness. He said, "Eric, why don't you tell me about the movie I'm working on? If you can convince me, I'll immediately kick that girl out." Even if Joe Silver did not say anything, Eric knew which movie Cindy Crawford was going to be in. If he did not count the other movies that she had guest starred in, the movie called Competitive Games was the only movie that Cindy Crawford starred in. Of course, it was also the last movie. This was because Competitive Games told a very chaotic and inappropriate story. A female lawyer accidentally discovered a spy ship of the KGB. In order to destroy the evidence, the Soviet KGB agents launched a series of assassinations on the female lawyer. During the entire process, the American Department of Violence seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The female lawyer and a police detective who was accidentally involved were chased by a group of KGB agents in America like stray dogs. They almost lost their lives several times. If it was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, a movie with such a theme might have caused some reaction. However, it was now 1994. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet power had collapsed. Russia had fallen into an economic winter, and the people were in a precarious situation. On the other hand, the self-confidence of the American people was unprecedentedly high. Under such circumstances, seeing such a movie that completely went against the main theme, and even had a somewhat absurd plot, one could only imagine the ending of the movie. Seeing that Eric did not object, Joe Silver explained the plot of Competitive Games to Eric. Of course, he wanted to get some advice from Eric. However, after he finished, Eric only shrugged and did not comment. Instead, he said to Joe Silver, "Joe, why don't you come to Firefly after you're done with this movie? I'll give you the same treatment as when you were in Warner. Also, I'm going to produce the movie version of The Matrix soon. I can let you be in charge of this project." Eric's words were completely sincere. Joe Silver was best at producing big-budget action movies like Die Hard, and Lethal Weapon. He complimented Jerry Bruckheimer, who had been recruited by Firefly and was good at CG special effects movies. As Firefly's strength continued to expand, Eric could not always maintain a state of being in charge of all the projects under his company. It was necessary to recruit more outstanding producers. Joe Silva was stunned when he heard Eric's words. He probed. "Eric, are you not optimistic about this movie?" Eric asked. "What's the progress on your side?" Joe Silva said. "Filming has already started. If all goes well, it will be released during summer next year." If the other party's project was still in the initial stages of preparation and had not invested too much money, Eric could tell the other party in detail about the key points in order to show his sincerity to Joe Silva and persuade him to cut off the project. However, since the movie had already started filming, a large amount of money had already been spent. There were many things that could not be reversed. Eric could only spread his hands at Joe Silva and said, "If you trust me, try your best to get Warner to fork out the production funds. Also, if you want to join Firefly, I welcome you at any time. The Matrix will only be released in the second half of next year. Before that, as long as you come over, the project is yours at any time." Competitive Games was definitely a huge production with an investment of more than $50 million. If this project was ruined, there would definitely be a crack in the relationship between Joe Silva and Warner. That would be a good opportunity for Firefly to poach him. Chapter 622. Eric's pessimistic judgment of Confrontational Game made Joe Silver's face turn solemn. Although Firefly and Warner Brothers were competitors, when it came to a movie project, Eric would not make any judgment at all. However, since he had spoken, he would definitely not spout nonsense. After all, the movie had to be released eventually. If the result of the movie was the opposite of what Eric had said, then Eric's words today would definitely make him a laughingstock in Hollywood. With Eric's current status, no movie was enough for him to joke around with his reputation. Hollywood was a social circle, but it was also unusually cold and heartless. The failure of a big-budget movie often signaled the departure of a certain executive or producer of the movie company. Therefore, it formed a unique dismissal season in Hollywood. Every year, after the summer break and New Year's, there would be people being kicked out of the movie company following the failure of some movies. The production cost of Confrontational Game was $50 million. Although it could not be compared to the super productions of recent years that easily cost $70 to $80 million, it was still a big-budget movie. Joe Silver understood that if the movie failed, although he would not be kicked out of Warner Brothers, the cooperation between the two parties would definitely not be as close as before. Although he was very tempted by Eric's recruitment, Joe Silver had been operating in Time Warner Brothers' system for almost 10 years. Unless it was absolutely necessary, he did not want to rashly switch to another company. After hesitating for a moment, Joe Silver could not help but test the waters. "Eric, what do you think is the problem with the movie? Is there any way to fix it?" Eric smiled and shook his head. "Joe, my position does not allow me to consult you in this regard. It's already very kind of me to tell you what I have just said." In his memory, there were too many problems with Confrontational Game. Although it was inevitable that action blockbusters would have weak plots, this movie did not even explain a weak plot clearly. Even if the Committee of State Security, KGB, was replaced with other evil forces, it would not make any difference to the movie. Eric felt that the only remedy was to directly cut off the project. Although this would make the early investment go to waste, it could save more production and distribution costs and avoid greater losses. However, the possibility of such a thing happening in Time Warner was very low. Time Warner Corporation's internal system was very bloated, and there were many factions. Every major production project was full of power struggles between various factions. If a movie had a bright future, of course the management would work together. But if the project had problems, the person in charge would definitely fight to shirk responsibility. Even if it was the CEO of Time Warner, as long as it did not affect his own interests, he would not take the risk of being questioned by the board of directors to cut off a project that was already in the filming stage. Eric was not willing to say more, and Joe Silver could not ask for more. Joe Silver had appeared at the party because he wanted to discuss a collaboration with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had regained his popularity because of True Lies. However, after hearing Eric's words, he cancelled his original plan. If the project of Confrontational Game was ruined, there would be no progress in the collaboration with Arnold Schwarzenegger. In some ways, Confrontational Game was similar to Die Hard Dragons. Joe Silver had originally hoped to create a popular action film series after Lethal Weapon and Die Hard Dragons. But now he was only thinking about how to avoid more losses. After all, the movie had just started filming. There was definitely still room to turn things around. On the way back to his mansion in Beverly Hills, the more Joe Silver thought about it, the more he felt that this matter could not be delayed. He called the few main creators of Competitive Game and told the driver to turn around and head to the Warner film set in Burbank. Cindy Crawford, who had left with Joe Silver, sat on the other side of the car. She looked at the anxious fatty next to her with an uneasy gaze. She felt an inexplicable sense of regret. Her manager had a good relationship with Edward Razek, the director of operations at Victoria's Secret. That was why Cindy Crawford had appeared at the party of True Lies, after hearing some news from Edward Razek. Eric's guess about Joe Silver was right. Cindy Crawford was not willing to give up her role as the female lead of Confrontational Game, but at the same time, she wanted to get the contract as the spokesperson for Victoria's Secret. She was quite confident in her charm. She thought that as long as she met Eric Williams face to face, everything would be as easy as pie. However, the current situation was completely different from what she had imagined. After the Cadillac drove for a while, Joe Silver noticed the woman next to him again. Initially, Joe Silver had planned to enjoy this beautiful woman tonight since she had delivered herself to his door. However, he no longer had the mood to play with women. Joe Silver knew very well that his power in Hollywood came from his movies. If he lost his job as a producer, his power would also disappear. Those women who used to be as docile as kittens would not even look at him anymore. The luxury car drove to another intersection. Joe Silver casually asked the driver to stop the car. He then said to Cindy Crawford, "Miss Crawford, I have something important to do. I'm afraid I can't drive you back to your place. I'm sorry." "It's all right, Mr. Silvo." Cindy Crawford left with a charming smile. After the driver opened the door for her, she elegantly got out of the car, not forgetting to wave at the luxurious car that was leaving behind a cloud of dust. After the Cadillac disappeared, Cindy Crawford retracted her figure and looked at the desolate streets around her. Amidst the clattering of a metal trash can, she soon heard a woman cursing, "D***M Los Angeles, D***M Hollywood." Anything. Even if it was worthless soil, if someone said it was good, they would definitely be able to find a basket of advantages. Similarly, even if it was a gem, if someone said it was bad, it would be easy to find a series of shortcomings. Joe Silver originally thought that the script of Competitive Games was very good, so he ignored the flaws that many people could easily find. However, when Eric, the legendary director who created the legend of box office sales, saw the story as worthless, the flaws in the script were immediately exposed. In a conference room at the headquarters of Warner Pictures in Burbank, although it was already early in the morning, the director of Competitive Games, Andrew Sipes, the screenwriter Charlie Fletcher, and several other assistant directors and production assistants were all silent in front of the gloomy Joe Silver. The problems that Eric could find, as long as the main creators of the movie were serious, they could find them. After all, these people had been in the movie industry for many years. "The shooting will be suspended for a week. I'll go and inform the headquarters. After a week, I want to see a brand new script." Joe Silver tapped his fingers on the table and stared at the results of a few hours of discussion in the memo. "The KGB gimmick can't be used. The Soviet Union is finished, and the KGB is no longer attractive to the audience. It can be changed to the mafia or the Latin American drug lords. Also, what's the situation with the male lead, Marx's ex-girlfriend? I remember that she only had one scene at the beginning. This role is dispensable. Why did she suddenly appear in the 24th scene?" Facing Joe Silver, who suddenly raised his head and stared at him sharply, the screenwriter Charlie Fletcher subconsciously glanced at the assistant director named Thomas Samuel on his left. Seeing this, how could Joe Silver not understand? He flipped through the actor's information beside him for a while, and found an actor's information. Then he looked at the assistant director named Thomas Samuel with a fake smile. Salma Hayek. Hee, the Hun tribe is really big. This Mexican girl must have served you well, right? Thomas Samuel realized that this was the prelude to Joe Silver's rage. He stood up in fear and said, "Mr. Silver, listen to my explanation. I just think that this character in the original work is very interesting. That's why I suggested. Your life will definitely be more interesting in the future." Joe Silver interrupted Thomas's quibbling. He crumpled the document in his hand and threw it at Thomas with all his might. "Now take your Mexican B*TCH and get out of here. Don't let me see you again in Hollywood." After the unlucky assistant director left the meeting room in a sorry state, Joe Silver coldly glanced at the others and said, "I don't care how you use your identity to deceive those ignorant little actors, but if you really dare to use your work to make a deal, I will definitely teach you a lesson. All of you better remember this. This is a business worth tens of millions of dollars. Tens of millions of dollars." After roaring, Joe Silver quickly calmed down and looked at the memo in his hand. He quickly raised his head again and said to the screenwriter, "Charlie Fletcher, the female lead has too many scenes. If she was Nicole Kidman, I wouldn't mind doing this. However, other than flirting, this character is completely reduced to a screaming vase in the later stages. Since there's nothing special about her, we'll focus on creating the male lead." Also, recalling what happened a few hours ago, Joe Silver said, "Inform Cindy Crawford tomorrow that she's fired. This woman doesn't have any box office appeal. Even if we need a vase, we need a vase with box office appeal." Director Andrew Sipes, who was sitting beside Joe Silver, said in a low voice, "But Mr. Silver, Cindy Crawford was introduced by Mr. Melnick." Joe Silver hesitated for less than a second, but when he recalled Eric's invitation at the party, he immediately said with confidence, "If I don't want to, no one can stuff people into my movie. If Melnick insists, I don't mind bringing this matter up to the board of directors of Warner Brothers." Benjamin Melnick, who Andrew Sipes mentioned, was the CEO and CFO of Warner Brothers. Most of the people in the meeting room knew that Joe Silver used to be very polite to Benjamin Melnick, so they were a little puzzled as to why Joe Silver suddenly became so much more forceful tonight. However, this was not something that small fries like them could care about. After all, it was very difficult for small fries like them to be involved in the conflict between the higher-ups. Therefore, they all nodded in agreement. Joe Silver was very satisfied with everyone's reaction. He said, "Then do any of you have any candidates to recommend?" Andrew Sipes said, "How about Claudia Schiffer? If we're talking about a vase, there's definitely no other vase in Hollywood who has more appeal than her. However, her current salary is about $5 million, which is 10 times what Cindy Crawford's salary is for this movie." Of course, Joe Silver knew about the relationship between Claudia and Eric. He subconsciously felt that if he sent out an invitation, Eric would definitely ask Claudia Schiffer to reject it. However, Joe Silver quickly thought of something else. If he handed over the revised script, what if Claudia Schiffer accepted it? Then it would very likely mean that Eric approved of the script. This benefit was definitely not something that could be bought with $5 million. He believed that Warner Brothers would definitely increase their budget by $5 million because of this reason. Moreover, even if they were rejected, they would not suffer any losses. "Contact Claudia Schiffer's agent immediately after daybreak," Joe Silver said to Andrew Sipes. "However, don't hand over the current script. Test the other party's schedule first. Only show it to them after the script has been revised." Andrew Sipes nodded and noted it down in a memo. "Then let's continue the discussion." Joe Silver took a sip of coffee to refresh himself. He said, "There are too many scenes where the male and female leads are being chased. This will make the audience feel depressed. Therefore, the chase scenes must be cut, and the scenes where the male and female leads work together to fight back should be added. This is what the audience wants to see." Of course, Eric did not know that his words had affected so many people and things in just one night. After attending the party last night, he thought of the matter of Victoria's Secret spokesperson and tried to make a call. Coincidentally, Claudia had just returned to Los Angeles, and Eric rushed to the girl's residence in Beverly Hills. In a mansion halfway up Beverly Hills, Eric was wearing a casual singlet and beach pants. He sat on the balcony on the second floor, enjoying the warm morning sun, and flipping through today's newspapers. Beneath his feet was the City of Angels, which was dyed golden by the morning sun. From afar, he could even see the entire city's streets moving like blood in the veins of the veins. The coquettish and languid Claudia was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. She carried a tray and walked out of the living room on the second floor. She placed the breakfast on the round table and leaned over to kiss Eric. She said, "I made a beef sandwich. Do you want to try it?" Eric pecked Claudia's sexy lips and pulled her into his embrace. He hugged her soft waist under the t-shirt and pointed at the breakfast on the table with a naughty smile. "I fed you last night, so it's your turn to feed me now." Claudia smiled coquettishly as she twisted her waist, but had no intention of breaking free. She obediently sat on Eric's lap and reached out to bring the sandwich to Eric's mouth. After taking a few bites of the sandwich, Eric suddenly recalled the matter that he had casually tossed to the back of his mind last night. He asked, coincidentally, "There's something I want to ask you. You know that I'm preparing for a runway show for Victoria's Secret, right? This brand needs 5 spokespersons, and 4 have already been confirmed. The endorsement fee will definitely be very generous. However, it's different from an ordinary runway show. I need some time to rehearse. Are you interested?" Claudia's eyes instantly lit up. She had always hoped to act in a movie directed by Eric. Although it wasn't a movie this time, Claudia knew that this was a great opportunity to spend time with Eric. However, Claudia soon shook her head in disappointment. If it was last year, it wouldn't be a problem. But it's not possible now. Eric didn't mind it. He only asked out of curiosity, "Didn't you just finish filming a movie? Why are you looking for another one so soon?" Shaking her head, Claudia regretfully said, "No, but I signed a 3-year endorsement contract with Farmina last year. So I definitely won't be able to participate in other brands' fashion shows. I'm really sorry, Eric." "It's fine. I was just casually asking." Eric shook his head with a smile. Claudia acknowledged before she charmingly leaned over and asked, "When do you intend to film your next movie? Can I be the female lead?" Sniffing the girl's fragrance, Eric replied, "I don't dare to make any promises to you. Before the Victoria's Secret fashion show ends, I won't have any plans for my next movie. But I can promise you that as long as there's a role suitable for you, I won't consider anyone else." "Really?" Claudia raised the corner of her lips. "You won't even consider Julia Roberts or Nicole Kidman?" Eric firmly nodded his head. "No, I won't consider them." Claudia smiled as she kissed Eric's cheek. "Although I know that you're just coaxing me, I'm still happy." "I'm definitely not coaxing you. The two of you are completely different types of actors, so there's no competition between the two of you." "Oh." Claudia's face immediately revealed a trace of disappointment. Her acting had clearly improved as she said in a bitter tone, "You must think that I'm just a vase." "Yes, the prettiest vase in Hollywood. Then you're still a vase." Claudia didn't seem to want to give up. She even reached out to pull Eric's collar as if she wanted Eric to take back his evaluation. Eric smiled as he pinched Claudia's face. He took the sandwich in her hand and finished it in a few bites. Then he suddenly carried the girl in his arms and walked into the room. "It's still early. Let me enjoy Miss Vase." "Hee-hee, don't do that." Chapter 623. Eric planned to hold the first Victoria's Secret show in the fashion capital, New York. However, to accommodate his busy schedule, the show was initially arranged in Los Angeles. After the preliminary list was selected, the new Victoria's Secret Angels had to participate in a custom-made body shaping program for at least a month at Eric's request. They had to maintain their figure until the end of the show. In Eric's opinion, compared to the hot angel supermodels in his memory, most of the current models were still used to maintaining a thin body. Of course, this kind of body could better showcase the design concepts of the famous brands in the fashion show. However, when they wore underwear, they didn't look as attractive. Except for the planned 5 spokespersons who would sign a special contract, the rest of the models didn't have a high salary during the show. Most of the models were paid about $50,000. Although this amount of money was enough to invite most of the top models to participate in a runway show. If the show took 4 months, no one would accept it under normal circumstances. This was also the main reason why the 2 popular supermodels, Cindy Crawford and Naomi Campbell, didn't agree to it. Their daily salary was already more than $10,000, so it was understandable that they didn't want to waste 4 months on a runway show. Eric didn't have time to personally explain the benefits of being the spokespersons for Victoria's Secret. As for the other models, Eric's attitude was the same. The contract was there. If someone couldn't see the benefits of being one of the 40 models out of thousands of models, they could also choose to reject it. However, the 40 selected models were smart enough to accept the contract and started the next step of the plan. At the same time, at the Yahoo headquarters in Boston on the West Coast, after a month of negotiations, the cooperation between Yahoo and Microsoft finally came to an end. Within 5 years, any advanced technology of Yahoo's browser must be used on the Windows platform first. The version updates for other operating systems must be 3 months after Windows. Chris, who was in Boston, explained the general content of the agreement to Eric over the phone. In addition, Yahoo must license all browser patents to Microsoft within 5 years. Unless Microsoft agrees, Yahoo must not transfer any browser software patents to any third party. Eric leaned against the leather chair in his office and listened to Chris. He smiled and said, "It seems that Microsoft has put most of their efforts into the browser. This is in line with our original agreement." Chris nodded and said, "Yes, Microsoft wanted to get some rights over Yahoo's email. However, after we compromised on the browser negotiations, Microsoft gave up on this idea." In Eric's opinion, an email account that could attract a large number of highly clingy users was definitely more important than the browser software. They must think that since Yahoo will belong to Microsoft in 5 years, as long as they can use the Yahoo browser to let the new generation of Windows system have an advantage over other operating systems, these are insignificant. What about the other conditions? Chris continued. Other than the browser software cooperation, the most important thing is the 30% share purchase. Microsoft will provide $100 million of debt financing to Yahoo for 30% of Yahoo's shares after 5 years. This agreement will take effect in July 1999. After that, Microsoft will have 3 months to consider if they want to acquire Yahoo's 30% shares. If Microsoft does not come up with a feasible acquisition plan after 3 months, it will be deemed that Microsoft has given up this share purchase. That's about it. The contract is more than 100 pages, and I have faxed it to your assistant's office. If you are interested, you can read it. There was a hint of a smile in Chris's voice. He knew that Eric wouldn't have the time to read such a professional contract. Eric smiled and shook his head. "I had just finished the audition for Resident Evil this morning, and I have a lot of materials to deal with. I still have to attend the premiere of The Lion King tonight. Do you think I have the time to watch it? Then get the lawyers to review this agreement as soon as possible. If there are no problems, I will sign the agreement with Microsoft next Monday," Chris said professionally. Also, Ian and the rest can't wait to launch the scripting language and instant messaging software after this agreement is signed. They want to give Microsoft a big surprise. Of course. I will give you an answer as soon as possible. Eric nodded. Both of them chatted for a while before hanging up. At the same time, Eric felt relieved. Once this agreement is signed, Microsoft will not interfere with the standards of the browser software. This will be a great boost to the Internet. Of course, this contract did not and could not restrict Microsoft from entering the Internet service industry. Although Microsoft was slow to react in many areas, Eric believed that with the explosion of the Internet industry in the next few years, Microsoft would definitely enter the market in advance to fight for the territory, even though they held the purchase shares of Yahoo. But as long as there is no dispute over the standards of the Internet, Eric believes that Microsoft will not be able to take advantage of Yahoo in other areas. Busy work always makes time fly. In the blink of an eye, it is evening. Eric changed his clothes in the resting room and drove to the Chinese Grand Theater in Hollywood. Although Eric had decided to close Disney's hand-drawn animation department, he will not ignore the best 2D animation in the original space-time. That's why he requested to attend the premiere. The Lion King had been screening on a small scale since 2 weeks ago. Currently, there were only a dozen pre-screening theaters in North America, and the box office had already exceeded $3 million. At the same time, Firefly had also invested a huge amount of publicity funds to promote the movie, and the premiere was even more spectacular. When Eric arrived at the entrance of the Chinese Grand Theater, the entrance ceremony for the premiere has already started. Eric did not walk on the red carpet like the other guests. Instead, he got off the car and walked directly on the red carpet under the guidance of the staff. Coincidentally, he walked together with the director of The Lion King, Roger Ailes. There are enthusiastic fans everywhere. The two of them walked to the interview area and answered a few questions. When Eric was about to leave, a slightly plump reporter suddenly tried to reach the recorder to Eric and shouted, "Mr. Williams, I heard that you plan to close Disney's hand-drawn animation department after The Lion King. Is this true?" Eric froze for a moment and looked at Roger Ailes beside him. Roger Ailes, who was originally excited, had a strange expression on his face. Eric did not know if this was the arrangement of someone with ulterior motives, but this matter could not be hidden for too long, so he nodded and said, "Yes." This answer made all the other reporters boil. The reporter who just asked the question again said loudly, "So, does this mean that Firefly is trying to suppress the influence of the Disney brand?" Eric did not immediately answer this somewhat harsh question. Instead, he asked, "I don't know why you would ask such an ignorant question. Do you think that the Disney brand and Disney's hand-drawn animation are equal?" The reporter replied, "The brand image of Disney is represented by Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. These are traditional 2D hand-drawn animation images. If Disney's hand-drawn animation department is eliminated, doesn't it mean that Disney's core values will disappear?" "I don't think so." Eric shook his head and said, "Technological growth is inevitable. Therefore, using more advanced 3D animation technology to replace 2D animation is just like using color movies to replace black and white movies. In my opinion, this is a destined trend. Firefly will never try to suppress any of its brands. Disney will always maintain the core value of using excellent works to bring joy to the audience." The reporter did not expect Eric to answer so sharply without any preparation. He was stunned for a moment, and the opportunity to ask was taken away by other reporters. "Mr. Williams, according to the test performance and excellent reputation of The Lion King, if the box office of The Lion King is very good, will you still insist on this decision?" Eric nodded and said, "I will continue to insist." After saying this, Eric ignored the other reporters' questions and walked straight into the theater. Back then, Eric had personally selected The Lion King from Disney's animation studio's options. Katzenberg had always been personally in charge of this project, so he also attended the premiere today. When Katzenberg heard some commotion outside from the staff, he immediately came out of the theater to greet them. "Eric, what happened?" Katzenberg greeted Roger Ailes and then asked Eric. Eric waved his hand and motioned for Roger Ailes to enter the theater early. Then he went to a corner with Katzenberg and told him what had just happened. He shook his head and smiled. "It seems that some people are still not convinced." Katzenberg was silent for a moment, then said, "Eric, according to our data survey during the pre-screening stage and the current scale of the premiere of The Lion King, most people think that the box office of The Lion King is likely to exceed $40 million in the first week. This will break the box office record of all Disney animated films. At that time, if you still insist on eliminating the hand-drawn animation department, many people will definitely be dissatisfied. I have already done a detailed analysis for you. You won't oppose me, right?" Katzenberg smiled and shook his head. Most of the senior executives of Firefly agreed with Eric's intention to make this decision. However, people are often affected by the sudden benefits in front of them. Just like this time, if the box office of The Lion King really reaches $40 million in the first week, it will set a new record for 2D hand-drawn animation. In this case, if Eric continues to do this, it will definitely bring a series of impacts. Eric, if you think it is necessary, Michael and I will hold a special meeting to discuss this matter. The Lion King was a project that you personally decided on. That is to say, even if this project is a box office success, the biggest credit is yours. Straighten out the cause and effect of this matter, and there will definitely not be too much of a problem. Eric nodded and added. In addition, the media should also pay attention. Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank's bond issuance work is already more than half done. I don't want any changes at this time. I know. If it really doesn't work, we can close the hand-drawn animation department after the bond issuance is over. After talking about this matter, Eric and Katzenberg walked into the cinema hall side by side. However, the media obviously did not intend to let go of this explosive topic easily, especially when some things were greatly beyond Eric's expectations. Although Eric remembered that The Lion King achieved a box office of $300 million in North America on its first screening, he still analyzed the specific box office curve according to the release trajectory of Disney's Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast. He expected The Lion King to be like other 2D hand-drawn animations, going on a long-term box office curve that would take half a year. However, the next day, after many newspapers reported that Eric was about to cancel Disney's hand-drawn animation department, a piece of news on Saturday once again blew up the media in North America, and even around the world, because the box office of The Lion King, on the first day greatly exceeded everyone's expectations. It was $15.6 million. This data was not too conspicuous compared to movies such as The Mummy and Saving Private Ryan, that were released some time ago. However, if it was compared to movies in the same genre, it would definitely shock a lot of people. The previous highest box office of a 2D animated film produced by Disney was Aladdin 2 years ago, with a box office of $220 million in North America. However, the box office of Aladdin was only $19 million in its first weekend. Note that the box office of Aladdin was $19 million in its first 3 days. During the 1992 Thanksgiving holiday, the box office of Aladdin was only $6 million. This also meant that the box office of The Lion King not only almost caught up with the box office of Aladdin in the first week, but it was more than twice the box office of Aladdin. Everyone realized that The Lion King was likely to be the first animated film in the history of the North American box office to exceed $300 million. In this case, Eric insisted on closing Disney's hand-drawn animation department, which suddenly triggered a series of violent chain reactions. Chapter 624. After experiencing the box office explosion of Saving Private Ryan and True Lies in June, the shareholders and creditors of Firefly, who had all kinds of calculations in their hearts, completely calmed down. The astonishing box office of The Lion King, which was more than $46 million in 3 days, made them start to reevaluate the value of their stocks and bonds. The production cost of The Lion King was only $45 million. Although the publicity cost had reached the same high level, the estimated $300 million box office in North America alone was enough to make Firefly a lot of money. The future income of the movie's sequels, overseas box office, video sales, and peripheral licensing would continue to bring Firefly more than $1 billion in profits. Some people in Hollywood even felt that the golden age of hand-drawn animated films had arrived again. The first reaction of Firefly's minority shareholders and creditors when they heard the news was that they hoped Firefly could increase its investment in hand-drawn animation, increasing the production speed of 1 film per 2 years to 1 film per year, or even more than 1 film per year. Therefore, when the news that Eric was going to close down Disney's animation film department after The Lion King appeared in the newspaper, no one believed the news was true. Because of this, when CNN played the recording of Eric answering a reporter's question at the premiere of The Lion King, the whole world thought that Eric Williams must be crazy. In the next few days, the offices and private phones of all the senior executives of Firefly, such as Katzenberg and Michael Lynn, were bombarded with calls from shareholders, creditors, and the media. Of course, Eric was even more unlikely to be let off. However, when some people contacted Eric, the call was directly transferred to his assistant's office. As long as it was an inquiry about Disney's animation studio, they would receive an affirmative answer, but no explanation. The agitated minority shareholders even publicly pressured the senior executives of Firefly in the newspaper, and the sales of Firefly's long-term bonds began to slow down again. The topic of closing down Disney's animation department attracted worldwide attention in just a few days. Later, there were even ridiculous remarks that Disney was about to go bankrupt. At Firefly Cineplex, in the studio where they were preparing for the Victoria's Secret fashion show, Eric, who was the subject of many people's worries, was engrossed in a discussion with a designer about the design of a Victoria's Secret angel costume. Outside the studio, a 35-year-old brown-haired woman in a black professional suit came to the entrance and showed her ID before she was let in. The woman searched through the group of designers, stylists, and models for a moment. After locking onto her target, she passed through the busy crowd and hurried to Eric's side. The brown-haired woman's name was Kelly Haynes. She was originally an assistant in Eric's assistant office. Although Eric had promised Carolyn and her roommate, Melanie Gleason, to work in his assistant office, the two girls had to complete their courses at Harvard before they could start working. Even if they started working, it would be impossible for them to fulfill the role of Eric's first assistant in a short period of time. Therefore, after returning from Boston, under Alan's recommendation, Eric chose this woman to be his first assistant. Feeling the figure approaching him in a hurry, Eric raised his head and noticed Kelly Haynes. He asked, "Kelly, what's the matter?" Kelly Haynes had been working in Eric's assistant office for several years, but she still seemed a little uncomfortable when she suddenly came to the big boss side. She calmed down a little and said, "Mr. Williams, Mr. Buffett just called in person. He said that he will arrive in Los Angeles at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and would like to invite you to dinner. In addition, Mr. Tom Murphy and Mr. David West will also come from New York." Warren Buffett, Tom Murphy, and David West, the president of State Street Global Fund, happened to be the members of the board of directors of Firefly that unexpectedly represented the 25% minority shareholders. Eric had already called a few people to explain briefly before, but these people obviously did not intend to let it go. Stopping the work at hand, Eric said, "Promise them for me. Also, have you prepared the information I asked you to prepare?" "Yes." Kelly Haynes took out a document from her bag and handed it to Eric. Eric shook his head with a smile and said, "Although these documents are not classified, you shouldn't have taken them out of the office without my request. And I don't have time to look at them now. Give them to me before dinner." Kelly Haynes' face was slightly red. She wanted to let Eric see the results of her work immediately, but she neglected some of the work rules that she used to pay attention to. Kelly Haynes put away the document again and said seriously, "I'm sorry, Mr. Williams, this is my mistake." "It's okay. Is there anything else?" Kelly Haynes took out a memo and said, "The Hearst Group, Condé Nast Group, News Corporation, and Netred Group have all made their own offers for the paper assets divested from ABC." At this point, Kelly Haynes suddenly paused, and then looked at the designer next to Eric, who seemed to be very focused on drawing. The designer did not have any other thoughts in his mind. He was just a little curious about the daily life of Eric, so he did not take the initiative to avoid him. But at this time he keenly felt Kelly Haynes' gaze. The designer awkwardly made an apologetic look to Eric, picked up the drawing board, and took the initiative to walk to another workbench nearby. This small episode did not have any impact on the communication between the two. Kelly Haynes continued, "At present, the Hearst Group has offered the highest price of $1.35 billion, followed by News Corporation's $1.3 billion, Condé Nast's $1.28 billion, and Netred's $1 billion. At the regular meeting in the morning, Mr. Lin and the others all felt that this was just the first round of testing by the publishing group. The final price of this asset should be between $1.5 billion and $1.6 billion. Eric nodded, indicating that he understood. Kelly Haynes did not expect Eric to discuss anything with her. If Eric had any ideas, Under normal circumstances, he would only discuss it with Michael Lynn and the others. She was only responsible for summarizing this information to Eric. Turning a page of the memo, Kelly Haynes could not help but look up at Eric's expression and said, "The head of the animation department, Mr. Peter Schneider, and the art consultant, Mr. Roy Disney, want to talk to you face to face. They said that this invitation represents the 758 employees of Disney's hand-drawn animation department. They hope you can take it seriously." I didn't expect Roy Disney to jump out. He really thinks of himself as the retired emperor of Disney. Eric smiled slightly mockingly. Whether it was the information in his memory or his impression of the real person after his rebirth, Eric did not like Roy Disney, a guy who liked to play with power. In the original Space-Time, in the mid-1980s, Roy Disney and the shareholders kicked out Walt Disney's son-in-law, completely erasing the influence of Walt Disney's bloodline branch on the Disney Company. In the mid-1990s, Roy Disney's shadow was involved in the resignation of Katzenberg and Michael Ovitz. At the beginning of the new century, Roy Disney once again mobilized the shareholders to vote to drive out Michael Eisner. It could be said that after the death of Walt Disney in the original Space-Time, Roy Disney's shadow was involved in every turmoil in Disney. Although some of these events had brought about a positive impact on the Disney Company, since this Space-Time Disney had become an asset under Firefly, Eric certainly would not allow Roy Disney, an unstable factor, to continue to exist. Therefore, not long after the acquisition of Disney, after the situation stabilized, Eric removed Roy Disney's position as the head of Disney's animation department because he was too old. He only symbolically kept the title of art consultant for him. After thinking for a while, Eric said, "Tell them that I will wait for them in my personal office in the studio at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." When Kelly Haynes heard Eric's casual tone, she even wondered if the big boss was aware of the chaotic situation in the outside world. She wanted to say something but hesitated for a moment. She quietly noted this on the memo and then said, "Mr. Williams, that's all for now. Is there anything you need us to do?" "No, just arrange a car to pick me up for the banquet tonight." Eric shook his head. Just as he was about to let Kelly Haynes leave, he suddenly thought of something else and asked, "I haven't had time to look at the box office report from last weekend. How much was the box office of Warner's Law Enforcement?" Kelly Haynes said, $7.5 million US. This film ranked 5th in the box office last weekend. After The Lion King, True Lies, Star Trek VII, and Saving Private Ryan, the film's reputation also declined. The agency estimates that the total box office of this film is between $25 million US to $30 million US. Including the publicity and other costs, Warner will have to bear a loss of $70 million US in the short term. The detailed report has been sent to your email. Eric did not hear anyone specifically mention this to him. He had already predicted the outcome of Law Enforcement. He gloated and said, "Warner will definitely not have any expectations for Westerns now." Kelly Haynes said, "Yes, Warner's total box office this year is ranked behind Firefly and Universal for the time being. However, Warner plans to release 29 films this year, one more than Firefly. Their subsequent box office accumulation is likely to be ranked second, because the other major film companies are all in a state of production reduction. After Firefly, Universal has 16 films, Paramount has 15 films, Fox has 13 films, Columbia and MGM have less than 10 films. Although the rest of the second-tier and third-tier film companies have released many films, their box office performance is not too outstanding." "It seems that you are very sensitive to numbers." Eric smiled and said, "I like women who are sensitive to numbers." "Thank you, Mr. Williams." Kelly Haynes realized that she actually felt a little flustered when facing the smile of this young man who was 10 years younger than her. She quickly said, "If there is nothing else." Eric realized that he had unknowingly crossed the line again. If Kelly Haynes was already married, then these slightly teasing words would be too abrupt. After calming himself down, Eric said, "You can go back to work. I will contact you if I need anything." At the premiere of The Lion King last Thursday, Eric Williams, the chairman of the board of directors of Firefly Group, suddenly confirmed a rumor that has been circulating in Hollywood for a long time. Firefly Group will close down Disney Animation Studio. It is reported that this is because Firefly intends to fully digitize animation production. But then, the dramatic change of this matter was beyond everyone's expectations. The Lion King, which was originally not very popular, not only doubled the first-day box office record of Disney's animation on its first day, but it also received an amazing box office of more than $46 million in 3 days on its first weekend. It broke many of Disney's 2D animation box office records in one fell swoop. The total box office is even expected to far exceed the 2 3D animations that Disney has released, Toy Story and Bugs Crisis. Later, our reporter called Firefly Group's CEO, Michael Lin, and the result was that Firefly will continue to implement the established animation production transformation plan. Then what impact will this have on Firefly and other Hollywood film companies? Let us welcome Mr. James Eltek, a professional film critic from Variety magazine. On the TV, the host of an NBC financial program got up and greeted the guest who walked into the studio. David West, the president of State Street Global Fund, who was sitting in front of the TV, could not help but sigh. He said to Tom Murphy next to him, "Young people are always so willful. Tom, do you think we can make Eric Williams change his mind?" Tom Murphy turned his head and looked at the clouds outside the porthole of the private jet. He shook his head and said, "If he insists on doing this, it seems that no one can stop him. I have already spoken to Warren on the phone last night. He seems to have heard something from Eric and is beginning to hesitate. This is an animation department that can produce 300 million films. Even if Williams really made such a decision back then and decided to cancel the original plan now, no one would blame him. I don't think there's a need for him to insist on sticking to his wrong plan. It's just too hard to accept." Tom Murphy suddenly asked, "If he insists on doing it, what are you going to do?" David West was stunned. He shook his head with a wry smile and said, "What can I do? Can I file a lawsuit in federal court to stop him from doing so?" The shares in Eric's hands meant that he had absolute control over Firefly. As long as it did not violate the law, he could adjust the business at will, closing down the hand-drawn animation department, because he was not optimistic about the development of 2D animation would cause controversy, but it would not violate the law. Both of them fell silent. Although they knew that they had another choice, which was to sell the Firefly shares in their hands and cash out. If they planned to do so, both Eric and Wall Street would be 100% willing to take over the Firefly Group shares in their hands. But now that the Firefly Group had surpassed Time Warner to become the largest media group in North America, only the most short-sighted people would be stupid enough to sell their shares. Listening to the debate between the host and the guest on the TV, Tom Murphy said after a long time, "I hope Eric Williams can give us a reasonable reason." You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.